Hey there, and welcome back. If the day is behind you now, and the lamp is low, and the house has gone quiet around you, then you have come to the right place, and you can let the day go. There is nothing left tonight that needs doing. There is only the quiet and the dark, and a story to carry you down into sleep. And tonight the story is of a man who stood for almost the whole of his life, one single step from the throne of England, and never took it. We are going back more than 600 years into the high age of the Middle Ages to walk through the life of the greatest subject the kingdom had ever known, the richest man in England, the son of one king and the father of another, who ruled the realm in all but name and yet never once wore the crown himself. His name was John, called John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, and his life ran through more splendour and more danger and more strange reversal than almost any other of his age. He loved a woman far beneath his station for the better part of his life, and married her at the last against the scandal of the whole court, and from that long forbidden love there would one day come a line of kings. He saw his mighty house on the river burned to the ground by a furious mob that wanted his head above all others in the land. And he died, an old man, only a few short weeks before his own exiled son came home across the sea to seize the very crown that the father had never reached for. Tonight we will walk the whole of that long road with him, from a boy born in a foreign city to an old duke dying in the cold of an English winter. And there is a love story at the heart of it. Quiet and patient and scandalous, that in the end would change the course of England, and we will come to it in time when the fire has burned a little lower. Before we set out, let me say a brief word to you, the one who has chosen to spend these hours here. For there are a great many places you might have gone tonight, and you came to this one. If you find, somewhere along the road ahead, that this telling has done its work, that it has carried you a little way out of your own day and down towards sleep, then you would be welcome to stay a while. To let this be a place you come back to when the nights are long and the dark comes early. There is a small, simple way to do that, with the button beneath this, and it costs you nothing and lets me know you would like to find your way back here again. And if you have a moment before you drift, I would love to know where you are listening from tonight and what the hour is where you are, the town or the country or the city. The rain on your window or the snow or the warm dark, for the messages reach me from all over the world, from people lying just as you are lying now in the quiet. And I look through them, every one, and they are one of the true pleasures of these evenings. But that can wait. For now there is only the road, and the man at the start of it, and the long life ahead of him. So picture this. It is high summer in the middle years of the 14th century, and on the broad grey sweep of the River Thames, between the City of London and the King's Great Hall at Westminster, there stands the most magnificent private house in all of England. It is called the Savoy, a palace in everything but name, a long range of pale stone walls and pinnacled roofs rising straight out of the water, with gardens running down to the river and a water gate where painted barges come and go. And inside it a world of marble and gold and tapestry and treasure such as few kings on earth could match. This is no royal palace. It belongs to a single man, a subject, the greatest lord in the kingdom, and within its gilded chambers move hundreds of servants and knights and clerks, a whole princely household ordered around one person. The man who owns all this, who built this glittering world and rules it, is still young, tall and strong and richly dressed, a prince of the blood, with the long Plantagenet face and the easy confidence of one who has never wanted for anything. He is the third surviving son of the King of England and the husband of the greatest heiress in the land, and one day men will fear him and hate him and bow to him across the whole of the realm. But all of that is still ahead of him. Tonight in the glory of the Savoy, we are going to begin, at the very beginning, in a foreign city far across the sea, on the day this remarkable man was born. So let us go back and begin. He was born in the late winter of the year 1340 in the great trading city of Ghent, away across the narrow sea in the wealthy cloth-weaving country of Flanders. And it was from that city of his birth that he took the name the world would always know him by. The English tongue, never gentle with foreign names, turned Ghent into Gaunt, and so the boy became John of Gaunt, a name that carried all his life, the faint memory of the foreign city where his mother had been brought to bed. His father was Edward, the third king of England to bear that name, a tall golden warrior king in the prime of his power, and his mother was Philippa of Hainaut, a kind and capable queen from those same Low Countries, much loved by the English people. The king was in Flanders that winter on the business of his great war, weaving the alliances and chasing the claims that would one day grow into the long struggle we remember now as the 100 Years' War. And the queen had come with him, as she so often did, and so it happened that their child was born not in England at all, but in a merchant's hall in a foreign town. It is worth picturing that city of his birth, for it was one of the wonders of the northern world. Ghent was a place of cloth and wealth, one of the richest towns in all of Europe, its skyline crowded with the high-stepped gables of the merchants and the high towers of its churches, its canals thick with the barges that carried the wool and the woven cloth that made its fortune. The looms clattered in 1,000 houses, and the bells rang out the hours over a busy, prosperous, self-willed town of weavers and traders who bowed to no lord lightly and who were, just then, useful friends to the King of England in his quarrel with the King of France. Into this foreign city of merchants and looms and ringing bells came the Queen of England to bear her child, and there, in a hired hall, amid the alien comforts of a great trading town, the boy was born. There was something fitting in it, though no one could have seen it then, that this most English of princes, this man who had come to stand at the very heart of England's story, should begin his life in a foreign land, among a people not his own, and carry the mark of it in his name for ever after. He never knew the city, of course, carried home to England as an infant and raised wholly as an English prince. But the name clung to him, John of Gaunt, a small permanent reminder that the greatest subject England ever raised had drawn his first breath in a weaver's town across the sea. He was their third son to live, and that simple fact of his birth order would shape the whole of his life, for he came into the world behind 2 elder brothers and a third son of a king, however royal his blood, was born to serve and not to reign. There is something almost poignant in that, when you set the helpless infant of those first days against the towering figure he would become. The child born in the merchant's hall in Ghent that winter could not know, of course, that he would grow into the richest man in his father's kingdom, the ruler of the realm in all but name, the founder of a line of kings. Nor could he know the long frustration folded into his greatness, the throne he would stand beside his whole life and never take. He was simply a king's third son, one more child in a crowded royal nursery, carried home across the sea to be raised among his brothers and sisters in the warmth of his mother's household. And the enormous and tangled life ahead of him lay all unguessed in the future, as the future always does, waiting to unfold. To understand what that meant, you must understand the world he was born into, for it was a world ordered with an iron sense of place and degree. At the very summit stood his father the king, and after the king came the king's eldest son, the heir, and that was the boy's eldest brother, Edward, the one history would remember as the Black Prince, a dazzling young warrior who was the pride of England and the very flower of chivalry. The crown would go to him, and after him to his children, and the younger sons of the king would stand always to one side of that golden line of succession. Great men, princes, but not kings. This was John's portion from his first breath. He would be raised in unimaginable splendour, given titles and lands and a place near the very top of the world, but the one thing he could never look to have, barring some catastrophe no one wished to imagine, was the throne itself. A third son served the crown, he did not wear it. And there is a particular shape to such a life, the life of the royal younger son, full of power and wealth, and yet built always around a centre he could not occupy. And the whole of John of Gaunt's long career would be lived in that shape, one step from the throne, near it, serving it, sometimes all but ruling in its name, and never, to the end of his days, sitting upon it. The hard rule that governed his whole destiny was the rule of inheritance, that the age held almost sacred, the rule that the eldest son took all, and the younger sons took what was left, an immense estate, a title, a crown, passed whole and undivided to the firstborn, so that the family's greatness should not be split and weakened down the generations, and the younger sons, however gifted, however royal, stood always in the shadow of the elder. Provided for, but not preferred, granted lands and marriages and honours, but never the first place. It was a system built to keep the foremost houses strong, and it worked, but it bore hard upon the younger sons, who grew up knowing that the highest prize was forever closed to them by the mere accident of their birth order, that an elder brother stood between them and the summit, and always would. Some such younger sons grew bitter and rebellious, plotting against the brothers who had been preferred over them. The history of every royal house is littered with the quarrels of envious younger sons. But John of Gaunt, though the reaching for a crown never quite left him, did not turn that way. He accepted, at the deepest level, the rightness of the order that placed him below his brother and his brother's son, and channeled his vast energies not into rebellion against it, but into the service of it, and into the search for a crown of his own somewhere else, across the sea, where no elder brother stood in his way. It was the wiser path, and the more honourable, and it cost him much, for it meant a lifetime of giving his strength to uphold the greatness of others, while his own ambition went unsatisfied. But it was the path he chose and held to, and it made him, for all his pride, the great loyal servant of his house, rather than the powerful betrayer of it. But these were not thoughts to trouble a child, and the boyhood of a king's son in that age was a thing of great brightness. He grew up in the heart of one of the most brilliant courts in Europe, for his father's England was riding high in those years, flushed with victory and wealth and the glamour of war. Picture the court he knew as a boy, a moving world of magnificence that travelled from palace to palace across the green English country, from Windsor to Westminster to the hunting lodges and the splendid castles, a court of feasts and tournaments and pageantry, of knights in bright surcoats and ladies in trailing silks, of minstrels and heralds, and the constant ceremony of a king at the height of his fame. His father loved the old tales of chivalry, of King Arthur and his knights, and built his whole kingship around them, founding a brotherhood of the finest knights in the land, the Order of the Garter, and holding tournaments of such splendour that men came from across Christendom to see them. Imagine one of those great tournaments through the eyes of the boy he was, for they were among the brightest things in his bright world. The lists were set up in a green meadow below the towers of a royal castle. The wooden barriers and the painted stands, all hung with banners and badges, and the bright arms of 100 noble houses. The whole country gathered in its finest to watch. The galleries were thick with ladies in their trailing gowns of silk and fur, the king and queen enthroned beneath a canopy of cloth of gold, the heralds in their tabards crying the names and the deeds of the knights who came forward to fight. And then the charge, the thunder of the great war horses down the length of the lists, the splintering crash of lance on shield, the roar of the crowd, the fallen knight and the victor wheeling his horse with his broken lance held high. To a small prince watching from the royal box, raised on the tales of Arthur and Lancelot, this was not mere sport, but the very image of how a man should live. The glory and the honour and the courage made visible in steel and colour and noise. He drank it in from his earliest years, the whole gorgeous theatre of chivalry that his father had built, and it shaped him for life, gave him the ideals he would carry to his grave. the deep conviction that a prince was born to fight and to lead, and to keep his honour bright, whatever the cost. He was raised, too, into the huge brotherhood of knighthood that his father had made the centre of his kingship, that select fellowship of the finest knights in the land, bound together by vows of honour and loyalty and service, who wore the same badge and held the same ideals, and gathered for solemn feasts under the eye of the king. To be admitted to that fellowship was the highest honour a man of arms could hope for, the mark of the truest chivalry, and the king's sons were of course among its foremost members, raised from the cradle in its ethos. The ideals it preached, of courage and loyalty and honour, of faith kept and obligations honoured, and the weak protected, were the ideals by which a noble man was supposed to live. And though the hard reality of the age fell often very far short of them, they were not mere empty words, but a code that shaped how men thought and judged and acted. John of Gaunt was formed by that code, and for all his pride and his ambition, he kept faith with the better part of it through his life. In his loyalty to his king and his house, in his bravery on the field, in the honouring of his word. The chivalry of his father's bright court was not, in him, a mere boyhood pageant soon outgrown. It sank deep, and gave him the framework of honour and loyalty within which he lived his whole long life. And it is one of the keys to understanding the man, this knightly code learned in childhood, that made loyalty to his king the deepest law of his being, and held him true when so many others, less bound by the old ideals, were breaking faith all around him. The hard reality of war, when he came to it, would prove a good deal less lovely than the tournament. But the dream of chivalry, planted in those bright boyhood spectacles, never left him. Into this gorgeous world John of Gaunt was born and raised, drinking in from his earliest years the ideals of knighthood and honour and noble blood, schooled alongside his brothers in the arts of war and courtesy, taught to ride and to fight and to bear himself as a prince. We may pause to picture the man he grew into, for the chroniclers and the few likenesses that survive give us something to go on. He was tall, as the men of his line tended to be, with the long bony face of the Plantagenets, and he carried himself with the easy commanding presence of a man bred to the very summit of the world, accustomed from the cradle to deference and obedience. He was, by the accounts that survive, proud, conscious, always of his royal blood and his exalted rank, quick to feel a slight to his dignity, and this pride, natural enough in a king's son raised in such splendour, was part of what made him so disliked by those beneath him, who found him haughty and overbearing. But there was more to him than the pride. He was brave, no one denied it, a soldier who had proved himself in hard campaigns. He was capable, an able administrator, and a shrewd politician who held his vast estates and his mighty affinity in good order for decades. He was, in his own way, a man of honour, faithful to his word and his obligations, loyal to his king and his house with a constancy that never broke. And beneath the proud and worldly exterior there ran, as we have seen, a deep capacity for love and grief, the tenderness for Blanche, the long devotion to Catherine, the care for his children, the loyalty to his brother. He was no simple figure, this John of Gaunt, neither the cold tyrant his enemies imagined, nor any plaster saint, but a large and complicated man, proud and tender, grasping and loyal, worldly and faithful, who contained within his single self most of the virtues and most of the vices of the great prince of his age, and lived them all out across one of the longest and most consequential lives of his century. And over all of it presided his mother the Queen, gentle Philippa, who kept a warm and crowded nursery, and seems to have given her many children a genuine family love beneath all the grandeur, so that the boy grew up not only in splendour, but, by every sign, in real affection, the cherished younger son of a happy and triumphant royal house. Above all the figures of his childhood, there towered his eldest brother, the Black Prince, 10 years older, and everything a young boy might worship. While John was still a child, his brother was already a famous warrior, the hero of the grand victory at Crecy, where he had won his spurs as a boy of 16, the most admired knight in Europe. The living embodiment of the chivalry, their father prized. There were other brothers too, and sisters, for the king and queen had bred a large and a famous family, and John grew up, one of a crowd of royal children, in a warm and bustling nursery presided over by his mother. But it was always the eldest, the Black Prince, who shone the brightest, and one can imagine the small John gazing up at this glorious elder brother as at something more than human, hanging on the tails of his deeds, longing to be like him. The bond between the brothers was a real and a deep one, and it ran the way such bonds so often run between a worshipped elder and an adoring younger. The mighty prince fond and protective, the younger fiercely loyal and a little in awe. And it planted in John, this early worship of his brother, the seed of the loyalty that would govern his whole life. For he learned to love not only the man, but the order the man stood for. The line of succession that ran from his father to his brother and on to his brother's children, the sacred shape of the royal house. To honour that line, to serve it, to keep faith with it, whatever happened, became as natural to him as breathing, learned at the knee of the brother he worshipped. And it would hold him true through every temptation and every grievance of his later life, when lesser men all around him were breaking their faith and reaching for what was not theirs. The boy who adored the Black Prince became the man who would not betray the Black Prince's son, even when that son had become a tyrant who feared him. The loyalty was bred in the nursery, and it lasted to the grave. To the small John, this brilliant elder brother must have seemed almost a god, the model of everything a prince should be, and the bond between them, the worshipping younger brother and the golden heir, would matter greatly in the years to come. For John of Gaunt would grow up loyal to that line of succession to the very marrow of his bones, devoted to his father and to his famous brother, and in time, to his brother's son, and that fierce dynastic loyalty. The loyalty of the younger son to the senior line would become one of the deepest things in him, the thing that held him steady through all the storms of his later life. He was born to serve the crown, and he learned in that bright chivalric boyhood to love the serving of it, and he never, in all his long and sometimes bitter life, truly turned from it. The making of John of Gaunt, the lifting of him from a king's younger son into the greatest magnate in the realm, came through a marriage, and it was, by every sign that survives, a marriage of real and tender love, as well as of vast advantage. While he was still a very young man, not yet 20, he was married to a girl named Blanche, the younger daughter of the Duke of Lancaster, who was the foremost nobleman in England after the royal family itself, a famous soldier and a man of immense estates. Blanche was beautiful and gentle and good, by all the accounts that come down to us, and the young couple seem to have loved each other truly. Two well-matched young people, joined in the bloom of their youth. The wedding of a king's son to the great heiress of Lancaster was, of course, a magnificent affair, a matter of state celebrated with all the splendour the age could muster. Days of feasting and jousting and ceremony before the eyes of the whole nobility. But behind the grandeur, there seems to have been something rarer and more precious, a genuine tenderness between the two young people thus joined for the convenience of their families. Blanche was, by every account that survives, a paragon of all that her age admired in a noble lady, fair of face and fair of nature, gracious and devout and kind, the very pattern of a mighty lord's wife. And John, young and ardent and proud, seems to have loved her wholly. We catch glimpses of the marriage in the records. The children born one after another, the household they kept together, the easy companionship of a union that had ripened from a bargain into a bond. It was the kind of fortune that the arranged marriages of the mighty so rarely produced, and that when it came was treasured all the more for its rareness. Two people who had been given to each other, and who found, in the giving, a real and lasting love. For perhaps a decade they had it, the young Duke and his lovely Duchess, the bright morning of his life, and the memory of that morning would lie beneath everything that came after. A lost brightness he carried with him through all his long and turbulent years, and returned to, in the end, when he asked to be buried at her side. Whatever the world would later say of John of Gaunt, and it said much, and much of it harsh, no one could say that he had not known, once, in his youth, a true and tender love, for he had, and he never forgot it. We are fortunate in this, for there lived in those years a poet who knew them both, a young man named Geoffrey Chaucer, who served in the royal household, and who would one day become the greatest poet of the English tongue. And Chaucer has left us, in a long and lovely poem, a portrait of Blanche, fair and fresh and full of grace, that lets us see her as her own age saw her, the lovely good Duchess whom her husband loved. It is a wonderful thing, this connection, and worth a moment of its own, for it joins the Duke's story to the very birth of English literature. Chaucer was bound to the household of John of Gaunt by more than service, for his own wife was the sister of Catherine Sandford, so that the poet was, by marriage, the Duke's own brother-in-law in the irregular family of the heart, tied into the intimate circle of that long love. He moved in the Duke's world, knew its people, watched its joys and sorrows, and out of it he drew in part the material of his art, beginning with that early elegy for the dead Blanche, and rising, across his life, to the great work that would make him the father of poetry in the English tongue. It is one of the quiet glories of John of Gaunt's story that the greatest poet England had yet produced lived within his orbit, lamented his wife, married into his love, and was sustained, in part, by his patronage. So that the gorgeous private world of the Duke, the marriages, and the love and the grief, was watched and remembered by an eye that could turn it into art. We see Blanche through Chaucer's verse, as we could never see her through the dry chronicles, fresh and fair and good. And in seeing her, so we see something of the Duke's own heart, the love that moved him to set a poet to mourning his lost wife. The mightiest magnate of the age, and the greatest poet of the age, joined by a marriage and a love, the splendour of the one giving shelter to the genius of the other, and the genius of the one preserving, forever, a glimpse of the human heart of the other. For a marriage made for land and alliance to grow into a true love match was no small fortune in that world, and John had it in his first marriage, and the memory of it would stay with him to the very end of his life. And the marriage brought him, beyond the love, a fortune almost beyond counting. For Blanche's father, the old Duke, died, and then her elder sister died without children. And so the whole of the vast Lancastrian inheritance, the broadest and richest estate in all of England, came down, through Blanche, into the hands of her young husband. At a stroke, John of Gaunt became the wealthiest and most powerful subject in the kingdom, master of a great swathe of England, of castles and manors and whole counties, of the loyalty and service of hundreds of knights, of an income that dwarfed that of every other lord in the land, and rivalled the king's own. His father raised him to his dead father-in-law's title, and so the king's third son became the Duke of Lancaster, and from that day forward he was, after the king and the heir, simply the greatest man in England. It is hard for us to grasp the scale of what he held, for there is nothing in our world quite like the wealth and power of a medieval magnate at the very summit of the nobility. Consider only the bare reckoning of it. He held lands in almost every county of England, a patchwork of estates so vast that a man might ride for days and never leave the Duke's country, manors and farms and forests and whole towns that paid him their rents and their dues. He held grand castles by the dozen fortresses scattered across the kingdom, each with its garrison and its officers and its store of arms, strongholds from which his power radiated out across the surrounding country. The heart of his greatness was the Duchy of Lancaster itself, that vast inheritance Blanche had brought him, and it was something more than an immense estate. For within its bounds the Duke held powers that were near to royal in their own right. In the county that gave the duchy its name, he ruled nearly as a king ruled the kingdom, holding his own courts, appointing his own officers, exercising a sway over the land and the people that the crown elsewhere reserved to itself. It was a kind of kingdom within the kingdom, this great northern lordship, and the Duke its prince, and the men who held their lands of him there, owed their loyalty and their service first to him before any other lord, before, almost, the king himself. To rule such a domain was to wield a power of a different order from that of an ordinary great lord, the power of a sovereign in all but name over a broad and populous country. And it was the foundation of everything else the Duke was, the deep root from which his wealth and his armies and his political weight all grew. And it would outlast him, this towering duchy, in a way he could not have foreseen. For when his son seized the throne, the Duchy of Lancaster did not melt into the crown lands, but was kept separate, held by the king as Duke of Lancaster, a distinct inheritance passed down through the centuries, so that the powerful lordship the old Duke had built endured in the hands of his royal descendants, long after the man himself was dust, a lasting monument to the greatness he had gathered. He held the loyalty and the service of an enormous affinity of knights and squires, men who wore his badge and took his wages and would ride to war at his summons, a private army larger than many a king could muster. His yearly income ran to a sum so splendid that it dwarfed every other fortune in the land and approached the revenue of the crown itself, a river of money flowing in from his lands and his offices and his rights. More wealth than any subject had any business possessing. And with the wealth came a power that was almost royal in its reach, the power to make and unmake lesser men, to fill offices and dispense favours, to overawe the courts and the councils, to act across great tracts of the kingdom, as a kind of king beneath a king. This was what fell to John of Gaunt through his marriage to Blanche, and it made him, while he was still a young man, not merely an eminent lord among powerful lords, but something of a different order altogether, a prince among subjects. A power in the land second only to the crown, and there were moments, in the years to come, when even that distinction would seem to blur. And men would wonder whether the over-mighty Duke might not be a greater force in England than the king himself. He could raise a private army from his own tenants. He kept a household that was a court in itself. His word was law across vast tracts of the country. There was a danger in such greatness, and the kings of England knew it well. The danger of the overmighty subject, the lord grown so rich and so powerful that he rivaled the crown itself, and might, if he chose, defy it. A king ruled, in that age, not by a standing army of his own, but through the mighty lords who held the land and commanded the men, and a lord as mighty as John of Gaunt, with his vast estates and his private army and his royal blood, was a power that could make or break a reign, a force the crown must either bind close in loyalty or fear as a rival. It was exactly this that made his lifelong loyalty so remarkable and so valuable, for a man with his strength could have been the most dangerous overmighty subject in the history of the realm, a maker and unmaker of kings, had he chosen to turn his power against the crown. That he did not, that he bent all that enormous strength to the service of the king instead of the seizing of the throne, was the great fact of his political life. And it was why, for all the hatred he drew, he was in truth the firmest pillar of the throne in his age. The same power that made men fear he might seize the crown made him, when he chose loyalty instead, the strongest support the crown possessed, and the kingdom learned the difference terribly when he died, for the over-mighty subjects who came after him. His own son among them did exactly what he had always refused to do, and turned their greatness against the crown, and plunged the realm into the long wars his restraint had so long held off. He was, in the plainest terms, a prince, lacking only a crown, and he was still a young man, when all of this fell into his hands. Lifted by love and by inheritance from the limited destiny of a third son into a greatness almost without limit. To see what that greatness looked like, we need only return to the Savoy, the palace on the Thames where our story began, for it was the jewel of his inheritance and the seat of his magnificence. It stood on the riverbank between the city and Westminster, on the grand road that linked the two, a long and splendid range of buildings behind high walls, with a chapel and a great hall and private chambers hung with cloth of gold, with gardens and orchards running down to the water, with cellars full of wine and storerooms full of treasure. Contemporaries spoke of it with wonder as the fairest house in the kingdom, finer than many a royal palace. And within its walls John of Gaunt kept a state that was truly princely. Walk with me through it, as it was in its glory, before the fire took it. You came to it by the river most often, for that was the vast highway of London, your barge gliding up to the Watergate, where the Duke's liveried men waited to hand you ashore. Within the walls there were courtyards and gardens, a chapel rich with gold and painted images, where the Duke heard Mass each day, and the great hall, the heart of the house, a vast chamber where hundreds might dine beneath a high-carved roof. The walls hung with tapestries telling the old stories of chivalry, the high table on its dais, where the Duke sat in state. There were the private chambers beyond, the Duke's own rooms and his ladies', hung with cloth of gold and warmed by foremost fires, furnished with beds and chairs and chests of a richness that beggared description, the windows glazed with coloured glass, the very basins and ewers of silver and gilt. There were the kitchens, vast and roaring, where whole oxen turned on the spits, and an army of cooks laboured to feed the hundreds of the household. There were the cellars deep and cool, stacked with the wine of Gascony. There were the stables full of fine horses, the mews for the hawks, the storerooms heaped with the goods of a princely establishment. And everywhere there were people, the great household of the Duke, the officers in their gowns, and the knights in their badges, and the servants without number, a whole ordered world of hundreds of souls, all of them turning about the person of the one man at its centre. The running of such a household was itself a kind of governance, a whole world ordered in careful ranks. At the top stood the chief officers, the steward who ran the hall, and the chamberlain who ran the private chambers, and the treasurer who kept the accounts, and the receiver who gathered in the rents from all the Duke's scattered lands. Men of standing in their own right, knights and gentlemen, who served the Duke as ministers, served a king. Below them ranged the knights and squires of the household, the young men of good family, who wore the Duke's livery and ate at his board and rode in his train, learning the arts of war and courtesy in his service, as he himself had once learned them in the king's. Below them again came the clerks and chaplains, who managed the writing and the religion of the house, and then the long descending ranks of the lesser servants, the cooks and bakers and brewers, the grooms and pages and porters, the men who tended the horses and the hawks and the hounds, the whole labouring foundation on which the magnificence rested. It moved with him from house to house, this mighty household, packing itself up and travelling the roads of England in a long train of carts and riders. For a mighty lord did not stay in one place, but progressed about his estates, consuming their produce and showing himself to his people and keeping his far-flung power in good order. To be the lord of such a household was to be the centre of a small kingdom of one's own, a world of hundreds of dependent lives, and John of Gaunt was the lord of the greatest of them all, the master of an establishment so vast and so splendid that it was, in everything but the name and the crown, the court of a king. To be received there was to step into a magnificence that few kings in Christendom could match, and the man who had made it and ruled it wore it, by every account, as easily as another man wears his coat. A prince entirely at home in his own splendour. And yet beneath all the worldly magnificence there ran in him, as in the great men of his age, a deep and serious religion. For he heard the Mass each day in his gilded chapel, and kept the feasts and fasts of the church, and gave generously to monasteries and to the poor. And he thought much, as all men then did, on the salvation of his soul and the long account he must one day render. There was no contradiction felt in that age between the sins a grand man committed and the piety he practised. For a man might keep a mistress and yet endow chantries where priests would sing for his soul, might wage cruel war and yet go humbly on pilgrimage, since the world was held to be full of sin and the church the appointed means of grace. And even the proudest prince knew that he must die and be judged and answer for his deeds. So the Duke, for all his pride and his ambition, and his long defiance of the church's teaching on his love, was at the same time a devout son of that church, careful for his soul, generous to religion, mindful of the end that comes to all. And when at the last he made his will in that winter castle, he gave careful and anxious thought to the prayers that should be said for him, and the masses that should be sung, ordering, like the pious man he was beneath all his greatness, that the church should plead for his soul down the long years to come, a mighty prince humbling himself, at the end, before the one Lord greater than any king. Hundreds of people served him there, and in his other foremost houses, a vast household ordered in careful ranks, from the great officers who managed his estates and his finances down through the knights and squires of his retinue, the clerks and chaplains, the cooks and grooms and servants without number. To be received at the Savoy was to enter a world of almost royal ceremony, and to wear the Duke's badge, the famous collar of linked S's that his men wore, was to be marked as the follower of the mightiest lord in England. This was the world John of Gaunt had come into by his early 20s, a world of which he was the absolute centre, and he wore it, by all accounts, with the natural ease of a man born to greatness, and lifted by fortune to its very peak. And yet for all the splendour, there was already a shadow in the shape of his life, the same shadow that had been there from his birth. He was the greatest subject in the land, but he was a subject still. All his wealth, all his power, all the magnificence of the Savoy rested on his place as the loyal younger son of the royal house, the servant of the crown that his elder brother would one day wear. He could be the first of the king's men, the strong right arm of the dynasty, the richest and mightiest lord in England, but he could not be the king, and everything he had depended on his remaining content with that. For most men, it would have been more than enough, a portion, to satisfy the wildest ambition. But there was in John of Gaunt, beneath the loyalty, a restless reaching for something more, a hunger to be a king somewhere, in his own right, that the limits of his English place could never satisfy. And that hunger, as we shall see, would lead him across the sea in pursuit of a foreign crown, and into one of the strangest and most costly adventures of his whole strange life. But that is still ahead of us. First, the young Duke had a war to learn, the great war of his age, and it is there, on the hard roads of France, that we must follow him next. The central fact of John of Gaunt's world, the thing that shaped the lives of every prince of his generation, was the war with France. The long and bitter struggle that his father had begun over his claim to the French crown, and that would drag on, with truces and flares of violence, for the better part of 100 years. To be a prince in that age was to be a soldier, and John was raised to it and rode to it as naturally as he breathed, crossing the narrow sea again and again to take his part in the campaigns that were the central business of his class. He learned war in the hard school of the French wars, in the long marches and the sieges and the powerful chevauchés, those sweeping rides through enemy country in which an army moved across the land burning and plundering as it went. A brutal strategy meant to break the enemy's will and strip his realm of its wealth. War in that age was a thing of seasons and of patience, far more than of splendid pitched battles, which were rare and which the wise commander often sought to avoid. For a battle was a throw of the dice that might lose in an afternoon what years of careful campaigning had won. Far more of a soldier's life was spent in the slow, grinding work of the siege, sitting down before a walled town and waiting week after week, while hunger did the work that the sword could not. The defenders within growing thinner and more desperate as their stores ran out, the besiegers without growing sicker and more weary as the camp fevers took hold, until at last one side or the other could endure no more, and far more still was spent simply moving the endless marches across hostile country, the army a slow river of men and horses and carts winding through the land, foraging as it went, harried by the enemy's riders, slowed by mud and swollen rivers, and the sheer labour of feeding so many mouths on the move. There was little glory in most of it, whatever the poets sang, only hardship and patience and the constant nearness of disease and death. And the commander who endured it best was not the dashing hero of the tournament, but the tough, patient, careful man who could hold an army together through the long grind and bring it home still fit to fight. John of Gaunt was that kind of soldier, by the judgment of his time, not brilliant but solid, not a winner of dazzling victories, but a dogged and capable campaigner, and he gave the strength of his middle years to that hard, unglamorous trade. Season after season, across the inconclusive wars of his age, there was glamour in it, the glamour of banners and trumpets and knightly deeds that the poets sang, and the young duke took his place in that bright pageant of chivalry with the pride of his blood. But there was also the other face of war, the grim and grinding face, the burned villages and the starving country, and the long miserable marches through rain and cold, the disease that killed more men than the sword, the slow bleeding away of money and lives in campaigns that won much glory and little lasting gain. To ride on a great chevauchee was to take part in something that the poets dressed in glory, and that was, on the ground, a thing of smoke and hunger and fear. An army would land on the coast of France and strike inland, moving fast across the enemy's country, and as it moved it destroyed, burning the villages and the crops, driving off the cattle, putting the farms and the mills and the storehouses to the torch, a deliberate laying waste meant to ruin the enemy king's lands and shame him before his own people for failing to protect them. The men slept in the open or in the shells of burned houses, marched through mud in the rain and choking dust in the heat, lived off what they could seize and went hungry when they could not, and died, far more of them, of the fluxes and fevers of the camp than ever fell to a French sword. There were the eminent set-piece battles too, rare and terrible, where the armies met at last in the open field, and the day was decided in a few bloody hours, and there were the long grinding sieges, an army sitting for months before the walls of some town, the defenders starving within, and the besiegers sickening without, until one side or the other broke. This was the school in which the young duke learned his trade, and he learned it well, growing into a tough and seasoned commander who knew the hard truth of war beneath all its banners. He was never the dazzling battle winner his brother had been, never the hero whose name made the enemy tremble, but he was a capable and a dogged soldier, brave in the field and steady on the long campaign. And he gave the better part of his middle life to the wars of his age, crossing the sea again and again to spend his strength and his fortune in the endless, inconclusive struggle that was the central fact of his century. John of Gaunt came to know both faces across his years of soldiering, the splendour and the squalor, and he was, by the judgment of his time, a brave and capable commander. If never quite the dazzling battle winner his mighty brother had been. For he was always, in the field as in everything, in the shadow of the Black Prince, and the most famous campaign of his early manhood was one he fought at his brother's side, away across the mountains in Spain. It came about through the tangled politics of the Spanish kingdoms, where a deposed king of Castile, driven from his throne, came begging to the English princes for help to win it back. The Black Prince, ever the knight-errant, took up his cause, and John of Gaunt rode with him, and together the brothers led a great army over the high passes of the Pyrenees in the depth of winter, a hard and perilous crossing, down into the harsh, dry country of Spain. There, on a field near a town called Najera, they met the enemy host and won a tremendous victory, one of the grand triumphs of English arms in that age. The Black Prince once again the hero of the day, and John of Gaunt distinguishing himself in the heart of the fighting. The crossing alone was an ordeal worthy of the old tales. To bring an army over the great wall of the Pyrenees in the dead of winter, up through the high passes where the snow lay deep and the wind cut like knives, and the narrow tracks ran along the edge of dizzying drops, was a feat that strained men and horses to their limit. The soldiers struggling through the cold with their gear, the baggage hauled up the icy slopes, the whole host inching over the roof of the world into the harsh, dry country beyond. They came down at last into Spain, footsore and frozen and far from home, and there they found the enemy waiting, a foremost army drawn up to bar their way. And on the field of Najera, the English did what the English of that age did so terribly well, broke the enemy host in a storm of arrows and a press of armoured men, and won the day, and set the exiled king back upon his Castilian throne. It was the longbow that did it, above all, that terrible English weapon that had won the great victories of the age. The massed archers loosing their clouds of arrows so fast and so thick that they darkened the sky and fell upon the enemy like a deadly rain, breaking the charge before it could close, sowing death and panic through the ranks before the armoured men-at-arms ever came to the press. The Duke fought in the thick of that press, where the fighting was hardest and most personal, the powerful lords and knights, hacking at one another, with sword and axe in the choking dust and din, and he bore himself well, by every account. A brave and capable commander, proving himself once more at his brother's side. It was the high noon of his soldiering, that day in Spain, the pitched battle won in a far country, and he could not have known how bitterly the rest of the Spanish adventure would sour, the victory leading only to disease and disappointment. His brother's health broken, his own dream of a Spanish crown planted to torment him for years to come. To John of Gaunt, fighting in the thick of it at his brother's side, it must have seemed the very summit of a knight's achievement. The perilous crossing accomplished, the battle won in a foreign land, the deposed king restored. And there was a particular sweetness in it for him, surely, that he won that glory beside his brother, the great Black Prince he had worshipped from boyhood. That the two of them fighting together in a far country, as they had perhaps dreamed of doing when they were boys steeped in the tales of Arthur. It was the last grand thing they would do together, the brothers in arms in Spain, for the sickness the prince took there would never leave him. And the golden hero would spend his remaining years in slow decline. But on that day at Najera, they stood together at the height of their powers, the famous elder and the proven younger, and won a victory that rang across Christendom. And for John, it must have been a moment to treasure all his life, the day he fought beside his hero and shared in his glory, before the long shadow of his brother's dying fell across the years to come. He had proved himself in the hardest of schools, beside the most famous warrior of the age, and covered his name in glory. He could not have known, in that hour of triumph, that the Spanish adventure carried within it the ruin of his brother's health and the planting of his own most costly dream, that the green, dry hills of Spain, so kind to him that day, would prove in the longer reckoning a country of sorrow for his house. The deposed king was set back on his throne, and the English princes had covered themselves in glory, and to the young John it must have seemed the very height of chivalric achievement. The crossing of the mountains and the great battle won in a foreign land. But the Spanish adventure carried within it two seeds that would grow strangely in the years to come. The first was a poison, for the campaign in that hot, dry country bred disease in the army. and many men sickened, and among them, it seems, the Black Prince himself, who came home from Spain with his health broken, struck by some wasting illness that he never threw off. The golden hero of England, the flower of chivalry, the heir to the throne, would never again be the man he had been before Spain. And from that campaign onward, his strength ebbed slowly away, a long decline that would in time leave the succession itself hanging by a thread. It was a slow tragedy to watch, the dying of the Black Prince, and it must have grieved John of Gaunt more than almost anything in his life. For this was the brother he had worshipped from the cradle, the model of everything a prince should be, the golden elder who had been the fixed star of his boyhood. And now that brilliant figure wasted away by inches, the strong body failing, the famous warrior who had terrified the French, reduced to a sick man unable to mount a horse. Lingering on through years of illness while the whole kingdom waited and grieved and feared for what his death would mean. For the dying of the heir threw the succession into doubt and danger. The old king was failing too. The realm faced the prospect of passing, when both the old king and his sick heir were gone, into the hands of whatever child the Black Prince left behind, a boy on the throne of a troubled kingdom. And it placed John of Gaunt in a position of terrible delicacy, for as the old king sank and the heir lay dying, he, the strong and able next brother, was the obvious man to hold the power, and there were those who muttered that he might hold it for himself, might reach past his dying brother's child for the crown. He did no such thing, then or ever. He stood by his dying brother, upheld the rights of his brother's son, and when both the old king and the great prince were gone, gave his loyal obedience to the child they left behind. But the long dying of the Black Prince was the hinge on which the whole later crisis turned, for it was that slow tragedy, the loss of the strong heir and the passing of the crown to a child, that set the kingdom on the road to all the troubles that followed. The second seed was an ambition, planted in John's own breast, for in Spain he had seen at first hand the winning and losing of crowns, the way a determined prince with an army at his back might make himself a king in a foreign land. And John of Gaunt, the third son who could never be king in England, looked at the kingdoms of Spain and saw, perhaps for the first time, a throne that a man like himself might actually reach. It was a thought that answered the deepest frustration of his life, the frustration of the royal younger son for whom the highest prize was forever closed at home. In England, he could be the greatest of subjects and never a king. The crown was his brother's and his brother's son's, and no honourable path led him to it. But abroad, in the tangled politics of the Spanish kingdoms, where thrones were won and lost by the sword, and a determined prince with an army might make himself a king, the prize that was closed to him at home seemed suddenly open. There he might be not the eternal second man, but a king in his own right, a sovereign, a wearer of a crown, and the dream of it took hold of him and would not let go. The dream of a kingdom of his own across the sea, where no elder brother stood in his way. It was, in a sense, the natural outlet for an ambition that could find no satisfaction at home. The reaching of a man too royal and too able to be content with the limits of his English place, and it drove him for the better part of his middle life, this Castilian dream, shaping his marriage and his wars and the very title by which he styled himself. That it failed in the end, that the crown he chased across the mountains eluded him as surely as the crown at home, only deepens the pattern of his life, the man forever reaching for the kingship that was always, by one accident or another, just beyond his grasp. He was born to be near a throne and never on it, at home and abroad alike. And the Spanish dream, for all its splendour, was only the grandest expression of that lifelong, unsatisfiable reaching. He filed the thought away, and it would surface again before long, and lead him into the long and costly pursuit of a Spanish crown. But all of that lay ahead. For now he came home from Spain, a proven soldier in his late 20s, rich beyond measure, married to a wife he loved, the father of a growing family, the greatest lord in England, standing at the very summit of his fortunes. And it was just then, at the height of everything, that the first great grief of his life fell upon him, and changed him, and opened the door, though he could not have known it, to the love that would shape all the rest of his days. The grief was the death of Blanche. While John was abroad at the wars, or soon after his return, his young wife sickened and died, carried off most likely by the plague that still swept through the country in waves in those years. The same towering pestilence that had killed a third of England a generation before, and that returned, again and again, to take the young and the strong without warning or mercy. She was still a young woman, the mother of his children, the love of his early manhood, and she was gone in the space of a sickness, leaving him a widower before he was 30. We must remember how such death came in that age, how swift and how merciless, for it shaped the way men and women loved and grieved. The Great Plague had come to England a generation before, and killed perhaps a third of all the people in the land, the most terrible mortality in the history of the country. And it had not gone away after that first horror, but returned, again and again, in waves, a recurring pestilence that swept through town and country and carried off the strong and the young as readily as the old and the weak. There was no defense against it and no cure, only flight, if one could flee, and prayer, and the dreadful waiting to see who would sicken next. A person might be well at dawn and dead by nightfall. The marks of the sickness coming up on the skin, the fever taking hold, the end following hard upon. To live in that age was to live always within sight of sudden death, to know that any parting might be the last, that the loveliest and the dearest might be snatched away between one day and the next. And so it took Blanche, the fair young duchess, in the space of a sickness, gone before her husband could well grasp that she was in danger, leaving him standing stunned in the wreck of his bright morning. The grief of it ran deep in him, deeper than the conventions of his rank required, and he poured it into the things he did to honour her. The splendid tomb, the yearly remembrance kept for 30 years, the poem he had written to lament her, and the last wish of all, that whatever came between, he should be laid at the end beside her. He would marry twice more, and love again, and live another 30 years of crowded and turbulent life. But Blanche was the love of his youth, taken from him young, and some part of him stayed with her in the cold cathedral, waiting, all those years, for the day he would come home to her side. We can measure the depth of his grief by the things he did to honour her memory, for they were not the gestures of a man merely doing his duty by a dead wife. He commissioned a splendid tomb for her in the great cathedral of St. Paul's in London, with both their figures carved upon it, for he meant from the first to be buried there beside her when his own time came, however many years and whatever other marriages might lie between. He kept the anniversary of her death with solemn observance every year for the rest of his life, decades of remembrance for the wife of his youth. And he had Chaucer, the poet of his household, write that long and tender elegy for her, the lament for a lost lady of surpassing grace and goodness, a poem that lets us still, across 600 years, feel the shape of the sorrow. For all the marriages and the politics and the powerful affairs that would fill his later life, John of Gaunt seems never to have forgotten Blanche, never to have stopped loving the memory of her, and his wish, faithfully carried out at the very end, to lie beside her in death, tells us more about the heart of the man than all the chronicles of his power. But life does not stop for grief, least of all the life of a splendid prince with a household to run and young children to raise, and it was the raising of those children that brought into John of Gaunt's life the woman who would, in the end, matter most of all. For among the people of his household, Charged with the care of his little daughters, his children by the dead Blanche, was a young woman named Catherine, the wife of one of his knights. A man named Hugh Swynford, who held lands of the Duke and served in his retinue. Catherine Swynford was not a noble lady. She was of respectable but modest birth, the daughter of a herald who had come over from those same Low Countries. A gentlewoman of the household and no more, exactly the sort of capable, well-bred young woman who might be trusted with the governess's task of raising a great lord's daughters. We should give Catherine her own due, for she is too often seen only as the shadow at the Duke's side, and she was a person in her own right, and a remarkable one. To hold the place she held, the love of the greatest prince in the land for a quarter of a century, through scandal and separation, and the long years of his other marriage, and to come at the last to be his wife and his duchess, took qualities of mind and character that the bare facts of the affair do not capture. She must have been clever and discreet and strong to walk so long and so dangerous a road without being broken by it, to keep the love of so proud and worldly a man through so many years and so many changes, to raise his children and her own, and to bear with dignity a position that exposed her always to the contempt of the huge. She was no mere pretty face that caught a prince's eye for a season. She was the steady companion of his heart across the better part of his adult life, the woman he returned to again and again, the one he chose, at the very end, above every grand match his rank could command. And she outlived him, and was buried in time in a grand cathedral in her own right, honoured as the duchess she had become, the herald's daughter who had risen by the long faithful love of a king's son, to be the first lady of the land and the ancestress of kings. Hers is a remarkable story in its own right, the more so for being so nearly lost in the shadow of his, and it deserves to be remembered. The governess who became a duchess, the patient love that outlasted every obstacle the proud world could raise against it. She was, by every sign, intelligent and graceful and good company, and she was beautiful, and she moved daily in the intimate world of the Duke's family, caring for his motherless girls, present in the private chambers where the public magnificence fell away and the man himself could be seen. Think of the peculiar intimacy of her place, for it explains much. A governess in a great household was not a servant in the common sense, scrubbing and carrying, but neither was she a great lady. She lived in between, a gentlewoman of trust, close to the family and yet not of it, present at the most private hours of their lives. She would have been there in the nursery and the schoolroom day after day, raising the Duke's small daughters, the children of the dead Blanche. And in the raising of those motherless girls, she would have come to know their father in a way that the noble ladies of the court, who saw him only in his public splendour, never could. She saw him grieving for his lost wife. She saw him with his children in the unguarded hours when the prince was set aside and only the man remained. She was a constant, quiet, capable presence in the heart of his home, trusted with what he held most dear, and out of that daily nearness, in the private spaces where rank counted for less and the human heart for more, the love grew. It was not the love of a grand alliance, calculated and announced. It was the slow, unlooked-for love of two people thrown together in the ordinary intimacy of a household, the widowed father and the woman who mothered his children. And perhaps that is why it proved so much stronger and so much more lasting than the grand marriages that bracketed it. It had grown in the real soil of daily life, in the nursery and the private chamber, and it had roots that no consideration of policy or rank could ever tear up. This was a rare and a precious thing in that world, for love, as we understand it, was not what marriage was meant to be about among the great. A marriage between noble houses was a contract, an alliance, a joining of lands and bloodlines arranged by elders for the advantage of the family, and the feelings of the two people joined were very far down the list of things that mattered. A mighty lord married for a dynasty, for an inheritance, for a claim to a crown, as the Duke himself married Blanche for her lands and Constance for her kingdom. And if love came with the bargain, as it had with Blanche, that was a happy accident and no part of the design. The love that the poets sang of, the consuming devotion of one heart to another, was held to belong outside marriage, in the dangerous realm of romance, and it was rather expected to be unhappy, or forbidden, or doomed. And so there is something almost subversive in the love of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford, for it was exactly the kind of love the age sang of and warned against, a love grown not from a contract, but from the heart, between two people of unequal rank, with no advantage to be had from it, and it did not stay safely in the realm of song, but broke into the open, and lasted, and triumphed, and ended not in doom, but in marriage and a dynasty. They loved against the whole logic of their world, for no reason of policy or gain, simply because they loved, and they held to it for a lifetime, and in doing so they wrote, without meaning to, one of the great love stories of the age, all the greater for being true. Whatever else the age would make of it, and it made much, it began as the truest kind of love, the kind that grows quietly between two people who have come, day by day, simply to know and to need each other. And somewhere in those years, in the quiet daily nearness of the household, between the widowed duke and the governess of his children, something began to grow that neither the difference in their rank nor the bonds of their existing lives could stop, a love that would last against every obstacle the age could put in its way, for the rest of John of Gaunt's life. It did not begin as anything the world was meant to see. Catherine was a married woman, the wife of the Duke's own knight, and John, for all that he was a widower, was a prince of the blood whose next marriage would be a great matter of state. Not a thing to be spent on a gentlewoman of his household. Whatever passed between them in those first years passed quietly, in the private spaces of a great household where so much went unrecorded, and we cannot now trace its beginnings with any certainty. But the shape of what followed is clear enough. Catherine's husband Hugh died away at the wars, leaving her a young widow, and from about that time the bond between her and the Duke deepened into a settled and lasting thing, an attachment that would endure for some quarter of a century. She became his mistress, in the plain language of the matter, the woman he loved and returned to through all the years of his other marriage and all the grand public business of his life. And she bore him children, a whole family of them, born outside of wedlock and yet openly acknowledged and cherished. And these children of theirs grew up to be remarkable in their own right, the Beauforts, the offspring of that long love, who would carry the Duke's blood and Catherine's into the high places of the realm. There were 3 sons and a daughter, and the Duke saw to it that they were raised as befitted his children, given good marriages and good livings and a fair start in the world, and they repaid the care by rising, after his death, into the very front rank of the nobility. One of his sons by Catherine would become a powerful churchman, a cardinal and a power in the land, one of the richest and most influential men of his day. Another would father the line that came down, at last, to Margaret Beaufort and through her to the Tudor kings. The daughter married into the high nobility and became, herself, an ancestress of kings. From the irregular union of the Duke and his governess, there sprang, in other words, not some hidden and shameful brood kept out of sight, but a vigorous and brilliant family that climbed to the summit of the kingdom and changed the course of its history. It is a testament to the strength of the bond between John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford, and to the care they took of the children of their love, that those children, born under the shadow of illegitimacy, should have risen so high and reached so far Until their blood sat upon the throne, the very claws of their legitimization had tried to bar them from. The love that the world condemned proved, in its fruits, more consequential than any of the Duke's lawful unions, and the children that the moralists called the issue of sin became, in the fullness of time, the ancestors of the most famous dynasty in English history. This was the foremost secret love of his life. Secret and yet not secret, for the world came to know of it well enough. A long, faithful constancy running quietly beneath the surface of his grand and turbulent public career. And we will follow it through the years ahead, for it is the true thread of his story. But first, the public man had a crown to chase, and a great political marriage to make, and it is to that strange double life, the dynastic marriage above and the long love beneath, that we must turn next. The crown he chased was the crown of Castile, the greatest of the Spanish kingdoms, and he chased it through a marriage. For the king he and his brother had set back on the Spanish throne did not keep it long. He was overthrown again and killed, murdered by a rival, and he left behind 2 daughters, the elder of whom, a young woman named Constance, was now in the eyes of those who had supported her father the rightful Queen of Castile. And John of Gaunt, the 3rd son with no English throne to hope for, saw his chance and took it. He married Constance, and by that marriage he claimed, in her right, the crown of Castile itself, and from that day he styled himself King of Castile and had himself addressed as a king and bore the arms of a king. A strange and grandiose claim to a throne he did not hold in a country. He did not rule. It was the answer to the old hunger, the 3rd son's reaching for a crown of his own, and for the rest of his middle years the Castilian dream would drive much of what he did. The towering ambition glittering, always just out of reach across the sea. The marriage to Constance was a marriage of pure policy, a means to a crown. And though they would have a daughter together, and though he treated his Spanish wife with all proper honour, there was in it none of the love that had bound him to Blanche. Constance was his queen in name and his partner in a grand ambition, and she lived in his household as a foreign princess in exile, keeping her Spanish ways and her Spanish servants, dreaming with him of the throne they might one day win. She is a poignant figure, this Spanish princess set down in an English household, and we should spare her a thought, for hers was not an easy lot. She had seen her father the king murdered, and her family driven from their throne, and she had come to England as the wife of a powerful prince, who valued her chiefly for the crown she carried in her blood, the living title to a kingdom he meant one day to win. About her, she kept the ways of her own country, her Castilian servants, and her Castilian tongue, and the rituals of the Spanish court she had lost. A little island of Spain in the heart of England, and she clung, year after year, to the dream of going home in triumph, of seeing her husband make good her claim and set her back upon her father's throne. She bore the Duke a daughter, and she held her place with dignity, the queen of an ambition, honoured and provided for, and treated with every proper respect. But she can hardly have failed to know of the other woman, of Catherine, of the love that ran beneath her own marriage and the children it produced, and there must have been a deep loneliness in her position. The foreign queen of a kingdom she could not reach, married to a man whose heart was elsewhere, dreaming of a homeland that grew, with every passing year, more distant and more unattainable. When at last the splendid campaign was fought and failed, and the dream of Castile was given up for a treaty and a pension, it was her claim that was sold, her birthright bargained away, though it bought at least a throne for her daughter. She lived a few more years and then died, the Spanish princess, far from Spain. And with her death, the road was clear at last for the love that had waited so long in the shadow of her marriage to step into the light. And here is the strangeness of John of Gaunt's middle life. The thing that makes him so human and so hard to judge across the centuries. For at the very same time that he was married to Constance, and styling himself a king and pursuing his grand Spanish destiny, he was also, quietly and faithfully, living a whole other life of the heart with Catherine Swynford. The two ran side by side, year after year, the public marriage and the private love, the queen in her chambers and the mistress in hers. And out of the love with Catherine there came children, born while he was married to Constance. A son, and then more children, 3 sons and a daughter in time. He did not hide them away in shame, as a careful man might have done. He acknowledged them, gave them a name and a place, and that name has rung down the centuries, for he called them Beaufort after a lordship he had once held in France, and the Beauforts, these children of his long love for Catherine Swynford, born outside his marriage in the middle of his life, would one day become one of the most consequential families in the whole history of England. But that lay far in the future. At the time they were simply what they were, the natural children of a great prince, and the woman he loved, raised in comfort and affection on the edge of the legitimate family. A living sign of a love that the Duke would not give up however much his rank and his marriage, and the judgment of the world might say he should. We should pause on what it cost, and what it meant, this long divided life, for it tells us much about the man. In an age that took the sin of adultery with deadly seriousness, that preached against it from every pulpit, the greatest lord in England kept a mistress openly for the better part of his life, and fathered a second family upon her. And this was a real scandal, a thing his enemies would throw in his face, and that the moralists of the day condemned. We should not soften it or explain it away, for it was a genuine transgression by the standards of his own world, and the Duke knew it. The church taught, and the people believed, that to keep a mistress and to breed children outside of marriage was a grave sin, a danger to the soul, and the keeping of such an arrangement by so prominent a man in the full view of the court and the country was a scandal that gave his many enemies a ready weapon. There came a time, indeed, in the dark days after the Peasants' Revolt, when the chastened Duke made a public show of repentance, putting Catherine away from him, separating himself from the woman and the sin, bowing to the judgment of the church and the world. It must have been a wretched business, that separation, whatever its outward show of piety. The Duke, shaken by the rising and the burning of his palace and the naked hatred of the people, seems to have searched his conscience and found there, among his sins, the long adultery with Catherine, and to have resolved, in a fit of repentance, to put it away, to end the affair, to make his peace with the church, and set his soul in order. And so they parted, the Duke and the woman he had loved for years, the arrangement formally ended, the scandal renounced. Catherine sent away from the household and the life she had shared with him. For a while it held. But the human heart is not so easily governed as the conscience would wish, and the bond between them was too deep and too long to be undone by a single act of penitence, however sincere. In time they came together again, quietly, the love reasserting itself against the renunciation, and it endured after that to the end of his life, and beyond the death of Constance, into their marriage at the last. The episode of the separation tells us much all the same, for it shows that the Duke knew his love for Catherine to be a sin by the lights of his age, felt the weight of it on his conscience, tried, in a dark hour, to give it up. And it shows even more how strong the love was, that it survived even his own attempt to end it, that having put her away in a fit of repentance, he could not, in the end, stay away, but returned to her and kept faith with her for the rest of his days. And for a while they were apart, but the love would not stay buried. In time they came together again, quietly, the bond reasserting itself against every prohibition, and it endured to the end, through repentance and relapse, through scandal and condemnation. Stronger than the Duke's own conscience and the censure of his age combined, It cost Catherine the most, as such things always cost the woman the most, exposing her to the contempt of the eminent and the blame of the moralists, making her, in the eyes of many, merely the Duke's harlot, whatever her own worth. And it cost the children something too, the shadow of their illegitimacy hanging over them until their father, at the last, contrived to lift it. But for all the cost, neither of them would let it go, and there is something in that stubborn, sinful, faithful persistence that is, in its own way, deeply moving. Two people clinging to each other across a quarter of a century against the whole weight of a world that told them they must not. It was not, by the rules of the age, a righteous love, but it was, by any measure, a true one. It exposed Catherine to shame and danger, for the woman in such an affair always bore the heavier blame, and it complicated his life endlessly, and it can have brought him no peace with the church he was in other ways, so concerned to honour. And yet he would not give it up, year after year, decade after decade. Whatever else the love between John of Gaunt and Catherine Swainford was, it was not a passing fancy or a mere convenience. For a convenience would have been set aside the moment it grew costly, and this was never set aside. It endured through his Castilian dreams and his English wars, through scandal and condemnation and the long years of his second marriage. A constancy so deep and so durable that it overrode every consideration of rank and policy and prudence that should, by all the rules of his world, have ended it. It is the most surprising thing about this proud and ambitious and worldly prince, this one huge faithfulness running through everything, and it is the thing that, in the very end, would prove the most lasting part of all he did. But before that end could come, John of Gaunt had to live through the most dangerous and most hated years of his life. The years when the old king, his father, was failing, and the kingdom was sliding into crisis, and the most powerful man in England became also the most despised. The crisis came as the old king came to the end of his long reign. Edward III, who had ruled England in glory for half a century, grew old and feeble at last, sinking into a sad senile decline. Falling under the sway of a grasping mistress, losing his grip on the realm he had once dominated. And worst of all, his great heir, the Black Prince, the golden hope of England, never recovered from the sickness he had brought home from Spain, but wasted slowly away through long years of illness, a dying man while still in the prime of life. With the king in his dotage and the heir on his sickbed, the government of England fell, by the sheer weight of his rank and ability, into the hands of John of Gaunt, the eldest of the king's sons, still standing strong. And for several years, in the middle of the decade, he was the effective ruler of the kingdom, the man who held the reins while the old king faded and the great prince died. It was the nearest he would ever come to the royal power he could never formally hold, and it should have been his hour of triumph. Instead, it became the source of his deepest unpopularity, for the realm he governed was unhappy, weary of a war that had turned against it, groaning under heavy taxes, and the men who looked for someone to blame found him. The proud and powerful Duke at the centre of everything, the obvious target for all their discontent. For the great war that had filled the kingdom with glory in the days of Crécy and Poitiers had turned, by these later years, into a long and bitter draining of the country's strength. The triumphs of the old king's prime had given way to defeats and retreats, the grand gains of the early years slipping back into French hands one by one, and the war, which had once paid for itself in plunder and ransom and conquered land, now cost more than it brought home, devouring money and men in campaigns that won nothing lasting. And the cost fell on the people, on the merchants and the farmers and the labourers, in tax after tax laid on to pay for the endless fighting, until the country that had once thrilled to its king's victories grew weary and resentful, sick of paying for a war that no longer brought glory or gain. When men are unhappy, they look for someone to blame, and the people of England, weary and overtaxed and humiliated by the turning of the war, looked at the proud, rich Duke who stood at the head of the failing government and found in him the very face of all that had gone wrong. It was not entirely just, for the troubles of the realm ran far deeper than any one man: the failing old king, the dying heir, the long bad luck of the war. But John of Gaunt was the most visible target, the mightiest and proudest and richest of them all, and the discontent of a whole unhappy kingdom gathered, fairly or not, upon his head, until he became the lightning rod for every grievance in the land. The man the people loved to hate. He was attacked from every side. When the Parliament met in the year the men of the time called the Good Parliament, the Commons rose up in anger against the corruption and misgovernment of the court. And though their fire was aimed at the king's grasping favourites, John of Gaunt, as the head of the government, took much of the blame, and he and his allies were forced into a humiliating retreat. It was a wretched end to a glorious reign, the long, sad decline of the old king. Edward III had been the greatest king in Christendom, the conqueror, the founder of the Garter, the very pattern of a warrior monarch, and now in his last years he sat feeble and failing, his mind clouding, his grip loosening, fallen under the influence of a grasping mistress who, men said, plundered the realm and ruled the dotard king for her own profit. The court grew corrupt, and the war went badly, and the money ran short, and the country, which had once thrilled to its king's victories, now grumbled and seethed at the misgovernment of his decline. When at last the Commons gathered in that famous Parliament and turned on the rotten court, demanding reform, casting down the corrupt officials and the king's mistress, it was a kind of revolt of the honest country against the failure at the top, and much of the anger washed up against John of Gaunt, who stood at the head of the government and seemed to many the protector of all that was wrong. He was forced to give ground, to see his friends cast down, to swallow the humiliation of the reforming Parliament, and he came out of it more hated than ever, the overmighty Duke who had failed the realm. And yet the moment the Parliament rose and went home, he set about quietly, undoing everything it had done, restoring his fallen friends, reversing its reforms, reasserting his grip, so that within a year the good Parliament's work was largely swept away. It was a display both of his power and of the high-handedness that made men fear and hate him, and it deepened the country's distrust of him. The sense that this proud Duke set himself above the law and the Commons alike, a sense that would burst into open flame soon enough in the fury of the vast revolt. He was hated by the City of London, whose powerful merchants resented his high-handed ways and feared his power, and the quarrel between the Duke and the Londoners would flare into real violence more than once. Mobs in the streets and the Duke fleeing for his safety. And he made himself more hated still by his quarrel with the Church, for John of Gaunt took under his protection a famous and controversial preacher, a scholar named John Wycliffe, who attacked the wealth and corruption of the clergy and questioned the very doctrines of the Church, and who would come to be seen as the father of heresy in England. Why exactly the Duke protected Wycliffe is not entirely clear. Perhaps he agreed with the attacks on the rich and worldly bishops, who were his rivals in the council. Perhaps he simply found the preacher useful against his enemies in the Church. But the protection tarred him with the brush of heresy in the eyes of many, the foremost lord shielding the dangerous preacher. And it added the fury of the devout to all the other resentments gathering against him. The quarrel with the Church was a serious matter, for the Church in that age was a power in the land to rival the crown itself, vastly rich, holding great estates, its bishops sitting in the king's council and ruling like princes, and to set oneself against it was no small thing. Wycliffe struck at exactly this, the wealth and the worldliness of the clergy, arguing that the Church should be poor and humble as its founder had been, that its immense possessions should be stripped away, that its claims to power over men's souls and men's goods were overblown and corrupt. And he went further in time, questioning the very doctrines of the faith, the teachings about the sacraments, and the authority of the Pope, until he had passed from a reformer into what the Church called a heretic, the most dangerous thing a man could be. To shield such a man was to flirt with the same charge oneself, and many wondered what the mighty Duke was about in giving the dangerous preacher his protection. Perhaps, as some thought, he genuinely sympathized with the attack on the proud worldly bishops, who were his rivals for power. Perhaps he simply found Wycliffe a useful weapon against the churchmen who opposed him in the council, a stick with which to beat his enemies. Whatever his reasons, the protection cost him dearly in reputation, for it joined to all his other unpopularity the deep suspicion of the devout, the sense that the overmighty Duke was a friend to heresy and an enemy to the Holy Church. And in an age of fierce and simple faith, that was a charge that stuck and festered and turned yet more of the kingdom against him. By the closing years of the old king's reign, John of Gaunt, the richest and most powerful man in England, was very probably also the most hated, distrusted by the commons, loathed by the Londoners, suspected by the Church, blamed for everything that had gone wrong with a kingdom in decline. And then the old king died, and the dying Black Prince was already in his grave before him, and the crown of England passed over John of Gaunt entirely, as by right it must, to settle upon the head of a child. For the Black Prince had left a son, a boy of 10 named Richard, and it was this grandchild of the old king, this son of the dead hero, who now became King Richard II, a child upon the throne of a troubled realm. Here was the supreme test of John of Gaunt's deepest loyalty, the loyalty to the line of succession that had been bred into him from birth. He was the most powerful man in the kingdom, an experienced ruler in the prime of his life, and the new king was a boy of 10. There were men who whispered that the Duke meant to seize the throne for himself, to push the child aside, and a more ruthless or less scrupulous prince might well have tried. But John of Gaunt did no such thing. He bowed to his young nephew, acknowledged him as king, and set himself, for all the strain it would later bring, to serve the boy and uphold his crown. Picture the coronation of the boy king, for it was a moment heavy with meaning for the man who watched it. The child Richard, not yet 11, was brought in vast state to the Abbey at Westminster, a small figure at the centre of the most solemn ceremony the kingdom knew, anointed with the holy oil, and crowned with the heavy crown, and seated upon the ancient throne, the whole nobility of England kneeling to do him homage. He was so young that he had to be carried at the last. The great day too much for the small body, and there was something both touching and ominous in it. This child set up to rule a hard and troubled realm. And among those who knelt to him, foremost among them was his uncle, John of Gaunt, the most powerful man in the kingdom, kneeling to a boy of 10. It would have been the easiest thing in the world, men thought, for the Duke to have pushed the child aside and taken the power, or even the crown, for himself. For he had the strength and the experience and the blood, and the realm cried out for a strong hand. But he did not. He had been raised from the cradle to revere the line of succession, to love and serve the rightful king. And the rightful king was this child, his brother's son, and so he knelt and gave his obedience and bent his enormous power to the service of a boy. It was, in its way, the noblest thing about him, this refusal to seize what was not his. This loyalty that held firm when seizing would have been so easy and so excusable, and it would be repaid, in the years to come, with suspicion and ingratitude. For the boy would grow into a man who feared his mighty uncle and never quite trusted the loyalty that had spared him. But the loyalty held, all the same, through every provocation, to the very end of the old Duke's life. The loyalty held. The third son, who had governed England in all but name, stepped back, when the moment came, and gave his obedience to a child, because that child was the rightful king, and the rightful king was the thing he had been raised, before all else, to serve. It was, in its way, the truest expression of who he was, this stepping back, and it would cost him much in the difficult years ahead, but he never wavered in it, not then and not later. Even when the boy he had served grew into a man who came to fear and to hate him, the hatred of John of Gaunt found its most terrible expression a few years into the young king's reign, in the grand rising of the common people that we remember now as the Peasants Revolt. It broke out in a summer of fury over a hated tax and a lifetime of grievance. The labouring people of the South, rising in their thousands and marching upon London, a vast angry tide of the poor and the desperate sweeping into the capital to demand justice from their boy king. The roots of it ran deep, far deeper than the single hated tax that lit the spark. Ever since the Great Plague had carried off so many of the people, the working folk of England, the labourers and the villeins who tilled the land, had found their labour suddenly scarce and therefore valuable. And they had begun to demand better wages and more freedom, to chafe against the old bonds of service that tied them to their lords. And the lords and the law had pushed back hard, trying to hold the people down in their old places, to fix their wages and bind them to the land, until an immense pressure of resentment had built up among the commons, a sense of ancient injustice ready to burst. The new tax, falling heaviest on the poor, was merely the match to a fire long laid, and when it caught, the rising spread with astonishing speed, the men of the countryside arming themselves with whatever they had, gathering into foremost angry bands, and marching on London with a fury that shook the kingdom to its foundations. They had their leaders and their slogans, and their simple, terrible demands: an end to serfdom, an end to the lords who oppressed them, justice from the king himself, whom they professed still to love, even as they cursed his ministers. And of all those ministers, of all the great men they blamed for their misery, there was one name they hated above every other, one man they marked for destruction before all the rest. And that man was John of Gaunt. To the rebels, he was the very face of the oppression they had risen against, the proudest and richest and most over-mighty of all the lords. And as the towering tide of the rising swept into London, it was toward his glittering palace by the river, above all, that the fury of the people turned. And of all the powerful men of the realm, there was one whose name the rebels cursed above every other, one whose destruction they wanted more than any other, and that man was John of Gaunt. To the common people, he was the embodiment of everything they hated: the proud, overmighty duke, the corrupt ruler, the author, as they saw it, of their misery. And as the rising swept into London, the mob turned its fury upon the most visible symbol of his greatness. They came to the Savoy, his glittering palace on the river, the fairest house in England, and they destroyed it. Picture that day, if you can, the day the Savoy died. The mob poured in through the gates, thousands of them, and they fell upon the palace of marble and gold with a kind of righteous frenzy. But here is the strange and telling thing, the thing the chroniclers marvelled at. They did not loot it. The rebels, in their fury, made a point of not stealing the duke's treasures, for they wished it known that they were not common thieves, but the bearers of a righteous anger, and so instead of carrying off his gold and his jewels and his rich hangings, they destroyed them. They smashed his treasures to pieces. They hacked his fine furnishings apart. They ground his jewels to powder and flung them into the river. They tore the gold cloth from the walls and burned it. They set the whole magnificent palace ablaze, and it burned through the day and into the night. The fairest house in the kingdom, going up in flame and smoke above the Thames. And when at last the fire died, there was nothing left of the Savoy but blackened and broken walls, a gutted ruin where the glory had been. Think of what was lost in that one day of burning, and of what the burning meant. The Savoy had been more than a house. It had been the very symbol of the Duke's greatness, the visible sign of his wealth and his power, the place where he kept his treasures and received the splendid and overawed all who entered with the magnificence of his state. To destroy it was to strike at the heart of what he was, to turn the proudest emblem of his greatness into a heap of smoking rubble, and the rebels knew exactly what they did. That they would not loot it, that they ground his treasures to dust and flung them in the river rather than carry them off, was the most telling thing of all, for it declared that this was no mere robbery, but an act of judgment. The people passing sentence on the Lord they hated, destroying his glory not for gain, but to humble him, to show him and all the world what they thought of his pride. And the lesson was not lost on him. To lose the fairest house in England, the work of his magnificence, to the deliberate fury of the common people, to see his glory so utterly cast down and so pointedly not plundered but simply destroyed, was a blow that struck deeper than the loss of mere wealth, vast as that wealth was. It told him, in letters of fire on the London sky, exactly how the people of England regarded their overmighty Duke, and the knowledge sobered him and stayed with him, and helped, in the years that followed, to remake him into a wiser and a humbler man than the proud prince whose palace had burned. One band of rebels, it was said, broke into the cellars to drink the Duke's wine, and were trapped there when the burning building collapsed and died in the flames and the fallen stone. Drunk in the ruins of the palace they had destroyed. And John of Gaunt was not there. By a chance that very likely saved his life, he was far away in the north of England, on the business of the Scottish border, when the rising broke out, and so the mob that wanted his head above all others never laid hands on him. But he heard the news, the destruction of the Savoy, the burning of the fairest house in the kingdom, the open and savage hatred of the common people made manifest in the ruin of his greatest possession. And it shook him as perhaps nothing else in his life had done. For a time he was a hunted man in his own country, uncertain even of his welcome, finding doors closed against him by men who feared to be associated with so hated a figure, taking refuge at last with the Scots he had so lately been fighting. There is a strange and almost pitiful scene buried in that flight, for it shows how low even the greatest man in England could be brought by the hatred of his countrymen. As the news of the rising spread north, and the Duke understood the depth of the fury aimed at him, he found himself suddenly friendless in his own land. He turned for shelter to a great northern fortress, a stronghold he might have thought to claim as an ally, and its keeper, fearing to be tainted by association with so hated a figure, fearing perhaps the wrath of the rebels or the suspicion of the king, refused him entry, shut the gates against the first prince of the realm. Door after door closed against him. Men who had bowed to him a week before, now afraid to be seen to harbour him, until the richest and mightiest subject in England, the king's own uncle, was driven to cross the border and seek refuge among the Scots, the very enemies he had so lately been making war upon, who received the fugitive Duke with a courtesy his own countrymen had denied him. There is a bitter irony in it. The overmighty Duke, the man who had ruled England in all but name, reduced to a homeless fugitive, sheltering with his enemies, while his palace burned, and it must have cut him to the bone. This naked revelation of how little his greatness was worth, the moment the people turned against him. He never forgot it, that summer of fire and flight, and it left its mark on him, a chastening, a sobering, that helped to turn the grasping Duke of his middle years into the steadier and wiser elder statesman of his last. The most powerful man in England had been driven by the fury of the poorest to seek shelter beyond the border, his eminent palace a smoking ruin, his name the most cursed in the land. The rising itself was soon put down. With the usual harshness, the boy king riding out to face the rebels and their leaders cut down, but the lesson of it stayed with John of Gaunt. He had seen, in the flames of the Savoy, exactly how the common people of England regarded him, and the knowledge of that hatred, the sheer depth of it, seems to have sobered something in him. In the years that followed he grew, by slow degrees, into a steadier and a more careful figure, less the grasping overmighty duke of the angry years, and more the responsible elder statesman, as though the burning of the Savoy had burned away some of the reckless ambition of his middle life. But the huge Castilian dream still burned in him too, and before he could become the elder statesman of his last years, he would chase that dream, at last, across the sea, in the one mighty adventure of his life, that was wholly his own. The chance to chase the Castilian crown came at last in the middle years of the young king's reign, and John of Gaunt seized it with all the pent-up longing of a lifetime. He gathered a great army and a fleet, poured into it a vast portion of his immense wealth, and sailed away across the sea to make himself, in fact, the King of Castile he had so long called himself in name. It was the grand gamble of his life, this expedition, and he flung himself into it with the pent-up longing of decades. He took with him not merely an army, but a court. His wife Constance, the rightful queen, his daughters, the whole apparatus of a royal household, for he meant not to raid, but to conquer and to reign, to plant himself in Spain as its king and rule there. The fleet that carried him was vast, the cost enormous. A substantial part of his vast fortune sunk into the venture, and as the ships stood out to sea, bearing the would-be King of Castile toward the kingdom he had claimed for 15 years, it must have seemed to him that the dream of his life was at last within his grasp. He landed in the green northwestern corner of Spain, in Galicia, a wet and hilly country of small towns and old churches. And for a season all went well. The towns opening their gates, the country submitting, the crown seeming almost won. But the deeper he pressed, the more the old enemy of his house rose against him. Not the swords of the Spanish, but the sicknesses of the land. The fluxes and fevers that bred in his camp in the heat and damp and swept through his crowded army like a scythe. His soldiers died, not in battle, but in their hundreds in the sick tents. The foremost host that he had brought so far at such cost melting away around him, until the army that was to win him a kingdom was too wasted and too few to win anything at all. The military dream collapsed, as his brother's Spanish dream had collapsed before it, killed by the same invisible enemy. And the would-be king was left to make what terms he could from the ruin of his grand design. He landed in the northwestern corner of Spain, in the green country of Galicia, and for a season the old dream seemed within his grasp. Towns submitting to him, the Castilian crown almost in his hand. But Spain proved as cruel to him as it had to his brother before him. The same enemy that had broken the Black Prince broke John of Gaunt's grand design, not the swords of the Castilians, but the diseases of the country, the sickness that swept through his camp in the heat and laid his soldiers low in their hundreds, melting away the great army he had brought so far at such cost. The military adventure faltered and failed, the crown slipped once more out of reach, and the would-be King of Castile was left with a ruined army and a broken campaign, the dream of a lifetime dying in the dust of a foreign land. And yet, out of the wreck of the military dream, John of Gaunt salvaged something cleverer and more lasting than a conquest. For if he could not win the Spanish crown by the sword, he found he could win it for his blood by the subtler arts of marriage and treaty. He came to terms with the rival King of Castile, and the terms were these, that he would give up his own claim to the throne forever, in exchange for an enormous sum of money and a yearly pension that would make him richer than ever, restoring and surpassing the fortune he had poured out on the failed campaign, and, far more importantly, that his daughter, his child by Constance, would marry the heir to the Castilian throne. And so it was done. The Duke renounced his crown, and his daughter married the young Prince of Castile, and in time, when that prince became king, she became his queen, so that the blood of John of Gaunt sat upon the throne of Castile after all. Not in his own person, but in the person of his daughter and all the kings of Spain who would descend from her. It was the cleverest stroke of his whole long pursuit, this turning of defeat into a kind of victory. For if he could not be king of Castile himself, he could make his daughter its queen, and so plant his blood upon the throne by marriage, where he had failed to seize it by war. And it served everyone, in its way. The rival who held Castile was freed from the threat of the Duke's claim, which was now joined to his own son's line rather than ranged against it. The Duke gained an enormous fortune and a yearly pension that made him richer than ever, and the satisfaction of seeing his daughter a queen. And the kingdom of Castile was spared the long war that a disputed crown might otherwise have brought. The treaty that ended the Duke's military dream was thus, in truth, a triumph of a subtler kind, a victory won not on the battlefield, where he had failed, but at the negotiating table and in the marriage bed, where he succeeded brilliantly. He had set out to win a crown by conquest, and come home having won it for his daughter by diplomacy, and if it was not the glory he had dreamed of, the would-be king reigning in splendour in a southern capital, it was something more lasting, for his blood would sit on the Castilian throne for generations after the memory of his failed campaign had faded. The man could not grasp a crown for himself, however hard he reached, but he had a genius, it seems, for winning them for his children, and the throne of Castile, like so much else, came to his blood, not through his ambition, but through the marriages he made for his daughters. Nor was that the only crown he won for his children in those years. For his other daughter, his child by the beloved Blanche, was married in the same season to the King of Portugal, and became the queen of that kingdom, and the mother of a famous line of Portuguese princes, celebrated ever after for their greatness. It is worth dwelling on those two daughters and their crowns, for in them the whole strange logic of the Duke's life is laid bare. He had spent a fortune and a fleet, and the lives of an army chasing a crown he could not hold. And he came away from the wreck of it, having won, instead, crowns for his girls. The elder, his daughter by Constance, married the heir of the very rival who held Castile, and so the long quarrel over that throne was healed in the marriage bed. The two claims joined. And when her husband came to reign, she was the Queen of Castile, and from her would descend the long line of Spanish kings. The younger, his daughter by his beloved Blanche, married the King of Portugal, and became the mother of a brood of remarkable princes, whom a later age would call the most brilliant generation that small kingdom ever produced, princes of learning and adventure, one of whom would set in motion the great voyages of discovery that opened the wider world. It is worth lingering on that daughter, for in her the Duke's blood reached further into the future of the world than perhaps anywhere else. She went south as a bride to a foreign king, and became a beloved and a famous queen of her adopted country, remembered there for her goodness and her learning, and above all for the remarkable sons she bore and raised. A whole generation of princes celebrated for their brilliance, their courage, their thirst for knowledge and adventure. One of those sons, her child and the Duke's grandson, became the mighty patron of exploration, who sent his ships venturing further and further down the coast of an unknown continent, opening the sea roads that would, in the generations after him, carry European sailors around the globe. So the blood of the old English Duke and his beloved Blanche, through their daughter, the Queen of Portugal, ran into the very wellspring of the great age of discovery, into the opening of that wider horizon that would remake the whole course of history. He had married his daughter to a foreign king for the ordinary reasons of policy and alliance, thinking, no doubt, of the advantage to his house and the settlement of his Spanish affairs. He could not have dreamed that from that marriage would come a line of princes who would help to fling open the gates of the unknown, that his blood would run in the veins of the men who launched the age of exploration. But so it was, and it is one more strand in the extraordinary web of consequence that spread out from his life, the English Duke, who never left his own corner of Europe, becoming, through his daughter, an ancestor of the men who sailed beyond the edge of the known world. So the blood of John of Gaunt, the English Duke who never wore a crown, came to sit upon the thrones of both the great Iberian kingdoms, and to flow down through the royal houses of Spain and Portugal for generations, mingling at last into half the dynasties of Europe. He had reached for a crown for himself, and grasped only air, and in the reaching he had, almost as an afterthought, made himself the grandsire of kings across the sea. It was the pattern of his whole life in miniature, the crown that slipped from his own hand settling, instead, upon the heads of his children, his ambition failing and his blood triumphing. The man himself always one step short of the thing he chased, and his descendants seizing it after him. John of Gaunt himself never wore a king's crown, but he made himself the father of two queens, the founder, through his daughters, of royal lines that would rule in Spain and in Portugal for generations, and that in the end was the strange fruit of his lifelong reaching for a throne, that he became not a king, but the ancestor of kings in more lands than one. He came home from Spain, an older and a wiser man, the vast ambition spent at last. The Castilian fever finally cooled, and he returned to an England that had changed greatly in his absence, and that badly needed exactly what he had now become. For while he had been away chasing his Spanish crown, the realm had fallen into bitter crisis. The young King Richard, grown now into a wilful and a wayward man, had quarrelled violently with the grand lords of his kingdom, who resented his favourites and feared his rule, and the quarrel had flared into open conflict. A faction of mighty nobles rising against the king's friends destroyed, the realm brought to the very brink of civil war. Into this dangerous and divided England John of Gaunt returned, and he found, perhaps to his own surprise, that the years had remade him in the eyes of his countrymen. He was no longer the hated, overmighty duke of his middle years. He was the senior prince of the blood, the old king's last surviving son, an elder statesman of vast experience and immense weight, and the warring parties looked to him, the one man great enough and respected enough to stand above the factions, to hold the kingdom together. His weight was felt beyond the borders of England too, in those last years, for he had become a figure of European stature, a prince whose name was known and respected across Christendom, and he lent his great authority to the cause of peace abroad, as well as at home. He took a leading part in the patient negotiations to make a lasting peace with France, to bring to an end, or at least to a long truce, the war that had drained both kingdoms for generations, and his voice carried weight in those grave councils where the fate of nations was settled, the senior statesman of England treating on something like equal terms with the mighty men of France. He had the standing for it, the deep experience, the royal blood, the air of a man who had seen everything and could no longer be surprised or overawed, and he used it, in his old age, in the service of a stability he had perhaps not always served in his hungrier youth. It was the role of the elder statesman in its fullest sense, the grand old prince lending his weight to the keeping of the peace, at home between the king and the lords, abroad between the warring crowns, and he filled it with a gravity and an authority that no other man of his age in England could match. The most hated man of one decade had become the most necessary of the next, the indispensable steadying weight at the centre of affairs, and the kingdom, which had once cursed his power, now leaned upon it, and would feel its loss, terribly, the moment it was gone. And he did. In the last phase of his long life, John of Gaunt became the peacemaker of the realm, the steadying hand, the foremost mediator who stood between the angry king and the angry lords and kept them, by the sheer authority of his presence, from tearing the kingdom apart. It was a remarkable transformation, and it tells us that there was always more to the man than the grasping overmighty duke his enemies saw. The same vast power that had made him so feared and hated in his middle years became, in his old age, the very thing that held the kingdom together, for he was now the one figure great enough to stand above the factions, too mighty to be ignored, and too royal to be set aside. The senior prince, whose words still carried a weight that no other lord could match. When the king and the leading lords fell to quarrelling, when the court split into bitter parties, and the realm trembled on the edge of civil war, it was to the old duke that men looked to hold the balance, and he did. Again and again, throwing his enormous weight now on one side and now on the other, never to win for himself but always to keep the peace, to stop the quarrel short of catastrophe, to hold the brittle structure of the realm from shattering. He had learned perhaps in the long years and the hard lessons, in the burning of the Savoy and the hatred of the people, a wisdom and a restraint that his younger self had lacked, and he spent it now in the service of stability. The great calming presence at the centre of a dangerous reign, and the measure of how well he did it would be written, terribly, in what happened the moment he was gone. For the peace he had held by his life alone did not survive him by a single year. While he lived, the kingdom held. When he died, it fell. There is no greater testament to the steadying weight of a man than that the realm he had quietly held together for a decade dissolved into usurpation and ruin within months of his death, as though the one pillar holding up the roof had been pulled away. The most hated man in England had become, in his old age, very nearly its most necessary, and for the better part of a decade, his calming weight held the peace of a realm that would dissolve into chaos the moment he was gone. And it was in these last years, the years of his grand old age, that John of Gaunt did the most surprising and the most human thing of his whole life. The thing that crowned the long secret faithfulness of his heart. His Spanish wife Constance died, the queen of his ambition, the partner of his Castilian dream, and with her death, the Duke was, for the second time, a widower, free at last to marry where he chose. He was an old man now, in his middle 50s, which was old indeed for that age, the senior statesman of the realm, with all the world expecting that if he married again at all, it would be some suitable fine match befitting his rank, and instead he married Catherine Swynford. After some 25 years of love, of constancy through every obstacle, of children born and a bond unbroken through all the splendour and danger of his public life, the greatest prince in England took as his third wife the gentlewoman who had been the governess of his children and the love of his life, and made her his duchess. It was an astonishment to the whole court, a scandal to many, the proud old duke wedding his long-time mistress, raising a woman of modest birth to be the first lady of the land after the queen herself. The proud ladies of the court were said to be outraged that they must now give place to Catherine Swynford, that this gentlewoman who had been the duke's mistress was set above them all as Duchess of Lancaster. But John of Gaunt did not care for their outrage. You must understand how the rigid world of rank received such a thing. To feel the scale of the scandal. The high-born ladies of England were the proudest women in the land, daughters and wives of earls and dukes, and they measured their whole standing by precedence, by who walked before whom and who sat above whom. The order of rank as real to them as the ground beneath their feet. And now they were told that this woman, this Catherine Swynford, who had been a mere gentlewoman of the household, a governess, the duke's kept mistress these 25 years and more, was to be the first lady of the kingdom after the queen herself. Set above every countess and duchess in the land, given the precedence and the honour they had thought belonged by right to the highest born. To the proud ladies of the court, it was an outrage against the very order of things, a scandalous overturning of rank, and they were said to grumble bitterly at it, to resent the elevation of the duke's old mistress over their well-born heads. But the old duke, who had loved this woman faithfully through a quarter of a century against the whole weight of the world, was not to be moved by the wounded pride of countesses. He had decided, at the last, when he was old and free and past all need to please, to give Catherine not merely his love, which she had always had, but his name and his rank and his honour, to make her openly and lawfully what she had so long been in his heart, and he did it, and let the court grumble as it would. There is a kind of magnificent indifference in it, the greatest prince in England, marrying his mistress in his old age, and shrugging off the scandal of the whole nobility, and it is, perhaps, the most purely admirable thing he ever did, this late, defiant, faithful keeping of his heart's long promise. He had loved this woman for the better part of his life, faithfully and against every rule of his world, and now, at the last, when he was free and old and past all need to please anyone, he married her and gave her the honour and the place that his heart had always held for her. But the marriage was only half of what he did for the woman he loved and the children she had given him, for there remained the matter of those children, the Beauforts, the sons and daughter born of their long love outside of wedlock. By the law of the church and the law of the land they were illegitimate, barred by the circumstances of their birth from the inheritance and the standing that legitimate children enjoyed. And the marriage of their parents, coming so late, did not by itself wipe that stain away. The matter of legitimacy was no small technicality in that age, but a thing that shaped a whole life from birth, the line between those who counted and those who did not. A child born within marriage was lawful, able to inherit its father's lands and titles and to take its place among the recognized kin. A child born outside marriage was a bastard, and however dearly its father might love it, however richly he might provide for it, it stood outside the lawful line of inheritance, barred from the honours and the estates that lawful birth conferred, marked with a stain that no amount of affection could by itself remove. The Beaufort children lived under that shadow, the love children of the Duke and Catherine, acknowledged and cherished and given every comfort, and yet, in the eyes of the law, set apart, unable to claim the inheritance and the standing that would have been theirs, by right had their parents been wed when they were born. It was to lift this shadow, to give his beloved children the lawful place that their birth had denied them, that John of Gaunt went to such lengths in his old age, securing from the highest powers in Christendom, from the Pope and from the King, the formal declaration that wiped the stain away and made the Beauforts lawful in the eyes of God and man. It was an act of fatherly love, plainly. The old Duke using all his vast influence to undo for his children the accident of their birth, and it succeeded, lifting them from the margins into the full light of legitimacy. But it carried, folded into it, that one small, fateful clause that barred them from the throne, and so the very document that secured their place, also planted, all unknowing, the seed of 100 years of war over the crown that clause had tried to put beyond their reach. And so John of Gaunt set out to have it wiped away by the highest authorities in Christendom. He obtained from the Pope himself a declaration legitimizing the children, and then, more importantly, he had the young King Richard, his nephew, issue a royal proclamation declaring the Beaufort children fully legitimate, fully able to inherit and to hold honours and to take their place among the great, as though they had been born within the marriage. With the stroke of a pen, by the joined authority of King and Pope, the children of the long-forbidden love were made legitimate, given a name and a future and a place in the world that no one could now deny them. And John of Gaunt had secured, for the family of his heart, everything that birth had withheld from them. It was the act of a father who loved his children and would not see them suffer for the manner of their making, and it was, though he could not have dreamed how far it would reach, one of the most consequential acts in the whole history of England. For there was a shadow upon the legitimization, a small clause that would matter enormously in the centuries to come. When the Beauforts were made legitimate, a line was added, at some point and by some hand, declaring that for all their new legitimacy, they were barred from any claim to the throne itself. They might inherit lands and titles and honours. They might rise as high as any family in the land, but the crown of England was placed forever beyond their reach. It was a careful, prudent qualification, meant no doubt to soothe any fear that the Duke's love children might one day reach for the throne, and at the time it can have seemed a small and sensible thing. But it created exactly the kind of ambiguity out of which civil wars are made, a family royal enough to dream and formally shut out from the object of the dream, close to the crown and barred from it. And in the troubled century that followed, that ambiguity would bear terrible fruit for the Beauforts. These legitimised children of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford would become one of the huge families of the realm, and from them, in time, in a way no one living in that year could possibly have foreseen, would descend a line that reached at last across 100 years of blood, all the way to the throne of England itself. The old Duke, marrying his mistress and legitimising his love children in the twilight of his life, was doing nothing grander, as he thought, than securing the happiness of his family. He was, in truth, planting the seed of a dynasty. In the last years of his life, John of Gaunt was a kind of living monument, the grand old man of the kingdom, the last surviving son of the mighty Edward, a link back to the golden age of English glory that was passing out of living memory. He had outlived almost all the figures of his youth, his brilliant brother the Black Prince long dead, his other brothers gone, his father a memory of half a century before, and he stood now at the head of the royal house, the senior prince, the patriarch, honoured for his age and his blood and his long service, even by those who had once hated him. He was, by the end, a bridge between two ages, the last living link to a vanished golden time. He had been born in the high noon of his father's glory, when England rode high on its victories, and the old king was the most admired monarch in Christendom, and he had lived to see all that brightness fade, the conquests lost, the old king dead in his sad dotage, the great heir wasted away, the realm sunk into faction and fear under a strange, suspicious boy-king grown into a tyrant. He held in his own person the memory of the great days, the days of Crecy and the founding of the Garter and the splendour of his father's court, days that were passing now out of all living memory save his. And he stood at the end of his life as a kind of monument to a greatness that had gone, the last of the old king's mighty sons, the final living link to the age of glory. And he stood too, all unknowing, at the very threshold of the age of blood that was to come, for the troubles that would tear the kingdom apart for a generation were already gathering in his last years. In the tyranny of his nephew and the ambition of his son, and his own death would be the signal for them to break. He was the hinge between the two ages, the bright past and the bloody future, the last of the old world of his father's glory, and the unwitting father of the new world of the warring roses. And there is something fitting and something sad in that this man, who had seen the whole arc of his country's fortunes, from the height of its medieval glory toward the bloody civil war that lay ahead, should have died just as the one age ended and the other, born in part of his own blood, began. Around him spread an enormous family, the fruit of his 3 unions and his long love. Scattered now across the thrones and the foremost houses of Europe, in a web of blood such as few men have ever woven. Through his first marriage, there were the children of Blanche, the legitimate Lancastrian line, his heir Henry chief among them. Through his daughters, there were the queens of Castile and of Portugal, and the royal lines of 2 foreign kingdoms descending from his blood. And through Catherine, there were the Beauforts, now legitimized and rising, a new and vigorous family taking their place among the immense. He had become this man who never wore a crown, the common ancestor of kings and queens across the whole of the Western world, the patriarch of a dynasty that reached from England to the far edges of Spain, and he lived to see it. The old Duke at the centre of his vast and glittering progeny, time-honoured as a later age would call him, the grand old root of a forest of royal blood. Sit for a moment with the sheer reach of what he had bred, for there is nothing quite like it in our history. From his loins, through his 3 unions and his long love, there sprang a posterity that would wear or claim the crowns of England, of Castile, of Portugal, and through them, in time, of half the kingdoms of Europe. His legitimate son would found a royal dynasty in England. His daughters were queens in Spain and Portugal. His love children, the Beauforts, would rise to greatness and reach, at the very last, the English throne itself. There can have been few men in all of history who could look about them in old age and see so many crowns gathered, present, and to come upon the heads of their own descendants. And John of Gaunt, who had reached so hungrily for a crown all his life, and never grasped one, became in the end the fountainhead of more royalty than any king of his age. It is the supreme irony of his life, and he lived just long enough to glimpse the beginning of it, the old patriarch at the centre of his enormous family, the queens his daughters, the rising Beauforts his and Catherine's children, his bold heir Henry. The whole glittering web of his blood spreading out across the thrones of the Western world. Time-honoured Lancaster, a later poet would call him, the grand old prince, at the root of everything, and the name fits, for he had become, by the end, less a man than a source, the spring from which a great river of kings would flow, the ancestor at whom, centuries later, the heralds of half of Europe would still be pointing as they traced the long descent of their master's blood. But for all the honour of his old age, there was a worm of trouble at the heart of the realm he had worked so hard to hold together, and it centred on the king, his nephew, the man he had served so loyally for 20 years and more. King Richard had grown into a strange and dangerous ruler, proud, suspicious, convinced of the sacred majesty of his own kingship, nursing old grievances against the lords who had once risen against him, and waiting for his chance to be revenged. He was a fascinating and a tragic figure, this nephew of the old duke, and very different from the warrior kings of his line. Where his grandfather and his mighty uncles had been men of the battlefield, hard, practical soldiers who knew that a king must lead his men in war, Richard was a man of the court and the chamber, a lover of art and ceremony and fine things, who exalted the mystery and the majesty of kingship to a height his blunter forebears would scarcely have recognized. He surrounded himself with favourites, demanded an almost worshipful reverence, brooded on the dignity of his crown and the wrongs done to it, and grew, as the years passed, ever more suspicious and ever more determined to make himself an absolute master in his own realm, beyond the checks of the powerful lords who had once humbled him in his youth. There was a coldness in him, and a long memory for injury. And when at last he felt strong enough, he turned on the lords who had crossed him years before and destroyed them with a calculated and patient cruelty that froze the whole court with fear. Through all of it, the old duke kept his loyalty, lent his weight to the king, tried to moderate and to steady, but it must have grown ever harder, for the king he served was sliding into a kind of tyranny, ruling by fear and favour, trusting no one, and the proud reverence of his kingship was curdling into something dangerous and unaccountable. And the old Duke can hardly have failed to see, in his last years, that this strange, suspicious nephew, whom he had served so faithfully since the boy was crowned, neither loved nor trusted him in return, but feared his power and resented his greatness, and would, the moment the old man was safely dead, strike at the House of Lancaster itself. And in the closing years of John of Gaunt's life that chance came, and the king struck at his old enemies with a sudden ruthless violence, destroying them one by one, and a kind of frightened tyranny settled over the court. No man certain of his safety, the king's favour the only shield, and the king's anger a sentence of ruin. Through all of it, the old Duke kept his loyalty, served the king, lent his great weight to the steadying of the realm, but it grew harder year by year, for the king he served was becoming a tyrant, and the peace he laboured to keep was growing brittle, and the great calming presence of John of Gaunt was the one thing holding the whole uneasy structure from collapse. And then the trouble reached into his own family, into his own heart, for the king turned at last upon the Duke's own son and heir. Henry, the Duke's eldest son by Blanche, a bold and capable and popular young man, fell into a bitter quarrel with another mighty lord, each accusing the other of treason, and the matter was to be settled in the old way by single combat, a duel to the death before the king and the whole court. This son Henry was the foremost hope of the House of Lancaster, the heir who would carry on the line, and he was, by all accounts, everything an aging father might wish, bold and capable and brave. A fine soldier who had won renown in tournaments and on crusade, in far countries popular with the people in a way his proud old father had never been. In him the greatness of the house seemed assured of a worthy continuation, the vast Lancastrian inheritance passing in time to strong and capable hands. And so the blow of his exile fell all the harder on the old Duke, for it was not merely a son banished, but the future of his whole house thrown into doubt, the heir driven out, the succession to all his greatness suddenly uncertain. There was, too, the dark question of the king's intent, for a suspicious and grasping king, with the heir of Lancaster safely out of the country, might be tempted to do exactly what this king in the end did, to seize the towering inheritance for himself the moment its old holder died. The aging Duke can hardly have failed to see the danger, and to dread it, and to grieve at his own helplessness, for he was failing now, an old man near his end, with no strength left to protect his son or his house against the malice of the king he had served so long and so faithfully. It was a bitter cup for the close of such a life. To see the loyalty of a lifetime so ill repaid, the heir exiled, the inheritance threatened, and nothing the old man could do but grieve and fail, and leave it all in the hands of a son across the sea and a God he must trust to set it right. But at the very last moment, with the two champions armed and mounted and ready to charge, the king stopped the combat, and instead of letting them fight, he banished them both from the realm, sending the Duke's son Henry into exile across the sea. It was one of the strangest scenes of that strange reign, and it has never been forgotten. The lists had been prepared with all the solemn ceremony of a trial by combat. The two great lords come to settle their deadly quarrel in the old way, before God and the king and the assembled chivalry of England. Henry of Lancaster, the Duke's son, and his accuser stood armed and mounted at opposite ends of the field, their lances couched, their horses gathered, the whole court hushed and waiting for the signal that would send them thundering at each other in a fight to the death. And then, with the tension at its breaking point, the king threw down his baton and halted the combat before a blow was struck, and after long suspense pronounced not a victor but a double sentence of exile, banishing both men from the kingdom, the Duke's heir among them, sent away across the sea for a term of years. It was a calculated stroke, for it rid the suspicious king of two powerful and dangerous lords at once, without the risk of letting either win, and it struck, whether the king fully meant it so or not, straight at the heart of the old duke, who must now watch his son and heir, the hope of his house, driven into exile by the very king he had served so faithfully all his life. There was a darker fear beneath the grief too, the fear of what the king might do to the powerful Lancastrian inheritance once its heir was safely out of the country, and that fear, as it turned out, was wholly justified. But for the moment there was only the bitter spectacle of the aged duke, failing now in health, watching his son ride away into banishment, helpless to prevent it. His lifetime of loyal service repaid with this cruel blow against his own child. It was a cruel blow to the old duke, to see his heir, the hope of his house, driven out of the kingdom by the king he had served so faithfully. And there was worse fear beneath it, the fear of what the suspicious king might do to the splendid Lancastrian inheritance, once its heir was safely out of the way. John of Gaunt was an old man now, failing in health, and the exile of his son was the last great sorrow of his life, the loyal servant of the crown, watching that crown turn against his own child, helpless, in his age and his weakness, to prevent it. There is a deep pathos in the close of his life, when you set it beside the loyalty that had governed the whole of it. He had been from the cradle the most faithful servant of the crown, the prince who knelt to a child rather than reach for a throne, who held his enormous power true to the king through every provocation, who had spent his life upholding the line of succession as the deepest law of his being. And the reward for that long faithfulness, at the very end, was to watch the king he had served strike at his own son and threaten his own house. The loyalty of a lifetime repaid with the exile of his heir and the looming theft of his inheritance. He had given everything to the royal house, and the royal house, in the person of his cold, suspicious nephew, was turning upon him in his old age and his weakness. And there was a cruel irony in it that the old duke must have felt to the bone. He had given his whole life to the line of succession, to the loyal service of the royal house, and now that house, in the person of his ungrateful nephew, was striking at the thing he loved most, and there was nothing the old man could do but grieve and fail and die. He died in the cold of the winter that followed, in the early months of the year 1399. An old man, worn out by his long and turbulent life, sinking at last in one of his own great castles with his Catherine. One hopes, near him at the end. The end came at one of his own eminent strongholds, a mighty castle in the heart of the Midlands that had long been among the chief seats of the House of Lancaster, and there, in the depth of winter, the old Duke laid down his life. He had time, it seems, to set his affairs in order, to make his will, that long and careful document in which a great man disposed of his soul and his goods, ordering the prayers that should be said for him, and the gifts that should be made, and the place where his body should lie. And in that ordering, his heart spoke clearly through all the formality, for he directed that he should be carried to St. Paul's and buried beside Blanche, in the tomb he had kept waiting these 30 years, and he made provision with mighty tenderness for Catherine, the wife of his old age, and for the children she had given him. He died, then, not suddenly and violently, as so many of his world did, cut down in battle, or struck by the sudden plague, but slowly and in his bed, an old man full of years, with time to compose himself and to make his peace and to arrange the disposal of his enormous life. It was a gentler end than many he had known, and it came, mercifully, before the storm broke, before he had to see his son robbed and his nephew fall and the kingdom torn apart. He went out of life with the old order still standing, his loyalty intact, his great house still the mightiest in the land. And he could not have guessed, as he made his careful will in that winter castle, how swiftly and how completely the realm he left behind him would be overturned by his own son within the year. He was very near 60, a great age for that hard century, and he had lived through almost the whole of the most glorious and the most troubled passage of his country's medieval history, from the high noon of his father's victories to the dark and frightened tyranny of his nephew's last years. He had been the richest man in England, the ruler of the realm in all but name, the most hated and then the most necessary of men, the founder of royal lines, the faithful lover of a woman he had married against all the world. And now it was over, the long restless, reaching at last at an end, and the old Duke laid down his enormous life. By his own long-held wish, he was carried to the Cathedral of St. Paul's in London and buried there beside Blanche, the wife of his youth, in the splendid tomb he had raised for her more than 30 years before. The two of them laid down together, at the last under the carved stone, the lovely young Duchess of his first love and the worn old prince who had never forgotten her. There is something almost unbearably moving in that last choice, when you set it against the whole crowded length of his life. He had loved 3 women, and married 2 of them, and lived his great love with the third. He had reached for crowns across the sea. He had ruled a kingdom, and been hated by a nation, and fathered the royalty of half of Europe. And at the very end, with all of it behind him, with Catherine surely in his heart, and very likely at his side, he asked to be laid, not beside his last love, nor his second wife, but beside Blanche, the girl he had married in his youth and lost so young, the wife of his bright morning, dead these 30 years and more. He had kept her tomb waiting all that time, had visited it, had marked the day of her death every year for 3 decades, and now he went home to her at the last. The worn old prince laid down beside the carved image of the lovely young Duchess. The two of them reunited in the cold stone after a lifetime apart. It does not cancel his love for Catherine, this final return to Blanche, any more than his love for Catherine had cancelled his love for Blanche. The human heart is wide enough to hold both, the first love and the last, and his evidently did. But it tells us that the bright morning of his youth, the brief sweet years with Blanche before the wars and the ambitions and the long divided life, had never left him, had lain beneath everything all along, and that when, at last, he was free of all the striving, it was to that first love that he chose to return. The proud, restless prince came home, in the end, to the girl he had married when the world was young, and was buried at her side, and there they lay together for 200 years, until the great fire that destroyed the old cathedral burned their tomb away, and not even their dust remained. Whatever else his heart had held across the long years, and it had held much, in death he went home to Blanche, and that, perhaps, is the truest measure of the man. But the peace of his deathbed was the last peace his house would know for a long while. For his death, far from ending the troubles of the realm, was the very thing that brought them crashing down. And the catastrophe followed so swiftly upon his passing that one might almost think the kingdom had been held together by his life alone. For no sooner was the old Duke in his grave than the king, his nephew, did the thing that all of Gaunt's fears had pointed to. With the grand steadying presence of his uncle gone at last, King Richard seized the entire Lancastrian inheritance. The vast estate that should by every law and custom have passed to the exiled heir, and declared that Henry, the Duke's son, would not, after all, be permitted to come home and claim it. It was an act of breathtaking folly, as well as injustice, for it tore up the very principle of inheritance on which the whole nobility depended, and it left the most powerful and popular young lord in England an exile with nothing left to lose. And Henry, robbed of his birthright, did exactly what a desperate and wronged man might be expected to do. He came home. The speed and the totality of what followed astonished everyone, and it is the surest sign of how much the dead Duke's steadying weight had mattered. For the moment he was gone, the whole structure of the realm came apart, in months. Henry landed quietly in the north with only a small band of followers, declaring at first that he came for nothing but his rightful inheritance, the lands and title the king had stolen, and asking only justice. But the kingdom had been waiting, it seemed, for exactly such a champion. The king was away in Ireland when his cousin landed, and in his absence the realm simply fell to Henry, lord after lord, and town after town, declaring for the wronged heir, the king's support melting away like snow. Until by the time Richard hurried back across the sea, there was scarcely a sword left to defend him. The hated king found himself a prisoner almost before he understood that he was at war, deserted by nearly everyone. His crown slipping from his head with hardly a blow, struck in its defence. It was a measure of how thoroughly Richard had thrown away the love of his people by his tyranny and his folly, and a measure, too, of how powerful the House of Lancaster had become. The house that the old Duke had built, that its heir could come home from exile with almost nothing and have a kingdom fall into his lap within weeks. The wronged man had come for his inheritance, and found a throne lying open before him, and being the bold and ambitious man he was, the son of the prince who had reached all his life for crowns, he did not stop at the inheritance. He landed in the north of England with a small force, declaring that he came only to claim his rightful inheritance, and the kingdom rose to him, the lords and the people flocking to the wronged heir. The hated king deserted on every side, until within a few short weeks the whole realm had fallen into Henry's hands almost without a blow. And then it went further than any inheritance. For with the king a prisoner and the kingdom at his feet, Henry of Lancaster, the son of John of Gaunt, did not stop at his lands, but reached for the crown itself. King Richard was forced to give up his throne, deposed and imprisoned, and would die not long after in a northern castle, quietly done away with, once he was no longer of any use alive. And Henry, the exiled heir, the son of the old Duke, who had served the crown so loyally all his life, was raised up in his place and crowned King of England, the fourth king to bear the name Henry, the first king of the House of Lancaster. So the blood of John of Gaunt came at last to the throne of England, not through the old Duke himself, who had served and never ceased, but through his son, who within a year of his father's death had taken the very crown that his father had been too loyal ever to reach for. It is one of the vast ironies of our history that the most loyal prince of his age, the man who stepped back from the throne when a child stood in his way, who served his nephew faithfully to the end, should be the father of the man who pulled that nephew down and founded a new royal dynasty upon his fall. John of Gaunt did not live to see it. He died loyal, with the old order still standing. But his death was the hinge on which it all turned, and the house he founded would sit upon the throne of England, for good and for ill, for the better part of the century to come. And what a house it would prove to be! What a strange and tangled and consequential legacy the old Duke left behind him in his blood. The line of Lancaster that his son founded gave England 3 kings, the bold Henry, who had seized the crown, and then the great warrior Henry, his grandson, the victor of the most famous battle of the age, the conqueror who came nearer than any English king to winning the crown of France itself, and then the gentle, broken Henry, his foremost grandson, the wholly innocent whose weakness would plunge the kingdom into the long civil wars we remember as the Wars of the Roses. For the very greatness of John of Gaunt's blood became, in the end, a curse upon the realm, because he was not the only son of Edward III to leave descendants with a claim to the throne. And when the Lancastrian king proved too weak to rule, the descendants of his brothers rose up to challenge the crown, and the House of Lancaster and the House of York, both of them sprung from the loins of old King Edward. To ree the kingdom to pieces, in a generation of slaughter, each claiming the throne by the blood that John of Gaunt and his brothers had carried. It is a grim irony and worth pausing on, that the very fertility and greatness of old King Edward's house should have been the thing that doomed it to civil war. A king with one strong line of heirs leaves a clear succession. A king with many mighty sons leaves many branches of royal blood and many claims, and the seeds of endless quarrel over which branch holds the better right. Edward III had bred a whole brood of sons, and from them descended a tangle of rival houses, each royal, each proud, each with its own reading of who ought to wear the crown. While a strong king sat the throne, the quarrel slept. But when the line of Lancaster came down at last, to a gentle, broken, holy man, unfit to rule, the sleeping quarrel woke, and the descendants of the king's other sons pressed their claims. And the realm split into the warring roses, the red of Lancaster and the white of York, and bled for a generation. The blood of John of Gaunt was on both sides of much of it, for he had bred so widely that his descendants and his brother's descendants faced each other across the battlefields, cousin against cousin, all of them carrying the royal blood of old King Edward, all of them killing each other for the crown that blood gave them the right to claim. The greatness the old Duke had built became, in the hands of his quarrelling posterity, an engine of slaughter, and the long agony of the Wars of the Roses was at bottom the bitter harvest of his and his family's overwhelming royalty. Too many princes too close to a throne that only one could hold. The old Duke, reaching all his life for crowns, had fathered a dynasty so royal that it could not rest, a blood so close to the throne on too many branches that it bred a civil war, and the long agony of the Roses was, in a sense, the bitter harvest of the greatness of Edward III's many sons, of whom John of Gaunt was the mightiest, and yet, out of all that blood and sorrow, it was the quietest and least likely branch of his family that reached, in the very end, the furthest of all. For the Beauforts, the children of his long love for Catherine Swynford, the love-children legitimised in his old age and barred, by that careful clause, from any claim to the throne, did not stay quiet forever. Down through the troubled century they rose and fell with the fortunes of Lancaster, and at the last, when the male lines of both the immense houses had very nearly destroyed each other in the wars, the claim of Lancaster came to rest upon a single slender thread, a mighty great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford, a small, determined woman named Margaret Beaufort. And it was her son, the grandson of a Welsh squire, and the heir, through his mother, of all the Beaufort blood, who gathered up the broken Lancastrian cause, met the last Yorkist king in battle, and won the crown of England on a field at the very end of the long wars. His name was Henry Tudor, and through his mother he carried the blood of John, of Gaunt, and Catherine Swynford, the blood of the old Duke and his beloved mistress, all the way to the throne of England. Think how unlikely it was, how slender the thread by which it came to pass. The Beauforts had been the love-children, born outside marriage, legitimised late and then barred, by that careful clause, from the throne itself. They were the junior branch, the irregular line, the offshoot that all the rules said could never reign. And yet it was precisely this barred and irregular branch that survived, when the vast legitimate lines had destroyed each other. The royal houses that the rules favoured, the proud legitimate descendants of old King Edward, slaughtered one another almost to extinction across the long wars, until the senior claims had been all but wiped out, and the inheritance of Lancaster came to rest, at the last, upon the Beaufort line, the children of the Duke's forbidden love. And it narrowed further still down through the deaths and the battles, until it ran through a single small determined woman, Margaret Beaufort, the immense granddaughter of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford, who carried the whole weight of the Lancastrian claim in her one frail person and poured her entire life into the cause of her only son. And that son, against all the odds, won the throne, ended the wars, married the heiress of the rival house, and founded the dynasty that would carry England into its most famous age. So the line that triumphed in the end was not the proud legitimate blood, but the love child's line, the descendants of the governess and the widowed prince, the fruit of the affair that all the world had condemned. The Tudors, who would give England some of the most famous monarchs in all its history, sprang from that long, quiet love in the Duke's household, and John of Gaunt, who had failed to win a crown by all his ambition, won one in the end, across 100 years, through the love he had refused to give up. The dynasty that would rule England through its most famous age, the dynasty of the Tudors, sprang in the end from that long-forbidden love affair in the Duke's household, from the governess and the widowed prince and the children born outside their marriage. The love that all the world had condemned and that John of Gaunt had refused through every obstacle to give up. He had reached all his life for a crown and never grasped it. But the love he would not surrender placed a crown, in the end, upon the head of his descendant. And the truest and most lasting of all his many legacies was not won by his ambition, but given by his heart. There is a deep and a strange justice in that, if you think on it. The way the thing he chased eluded him, and the thing he simply loved endured. All his striving for crowns, all the fortunes and the armies poured into the chase, all the grand ambition of his hungry years, came in the end to little. The Castilian throne renounced for a pension, the English crown never his to take, the great wars won and lost and forgotten. But the love he had given to Catherine Swynford, the love that brought him no advantage and cost him much, that he kept faith with against the whole judgment of the world for no reason, but that he loved her. That love outlasted all the ambition and bore the fruit that all the striving could not. A line that reached, in the end, the very throne he had never reached himself. It is as though the universe had a lesson folded into the shape of his life, that what a man grasps for slips away, and what a man simply loves endures. That the ambition burns out, and the affection abides. He did not plan it so. He was as hungry for crowns as any prince of his age, and would have seized one gladly had he been able. But he could not, and instead he loved, faithfully and against all sense. And the love did what the ambition never could, and set his blood upon the throne. The crown came to his house at last, not as the prize of his reaching, but as the gift of his heart. And that, perhaps, is the deepest and the truest thing in the whole long story of John of Gaunt. So that is the life of John of Gaunt, the third son who was never a king, who stood his whole life one step from the throne and never took it. He was the richest man in England and the most hated, the ruler of the realm and the servant of a child, the father of queens and the founder of a royal house, a soldier and a statesman, and beneath all of it, for the whole of his long life, the faithful lover of one woman against the judgment of the world. He is, in the end, a man hard to sum up, because he held so many contradictions within his single self. He was proud and grasping, and his overmighty power made him feared and hated across the realm. And yet he was also, when the foremost test came, more loyal than any other lord of his age. That the prince who knelt to a child and served him faithfully when seizing the crown would have been so easy. He reached all his life for thrones he could not hold, and squandered fortunes and armies on the chase. And yet he made himself, in the failing, the ancestor of more kings than any conqueror. He sinned openly against the morality of his age, kept a mistress for a quarter of a century in the face of the church and the court, and yet that same long love was the truest and most faithful thing in his life, and the source, in the end, of his most lasting legacy. He was a creature of his hard and glittering century, ambitious and worldly and proud, and he was also a man capable of a love that lasted a lifetime and a loyalty that never broke, and the two sides of him ran together, inseparable, all his days. Perhaps that is why he stays so vivid across the centuries, this John of Gaunt, because he was so fully human, so large in his faults and his virtues alike. Neither the villain his enemies painted, nor any kind of saint, but a towering, flawed, faithful, striving man who lived an enormous life, one single step from a throne he never took, and left behind him when he died, both the seeds of a terrible war and the seeds of a famous dynasty, the bitter and the sweet together, the whole tangled harvest of his blood. The centuries have judged him in many ways, swinging from one verdict to another as the fashions of memory changed. In his own time, he was hated and feared. The overmighty duke, the grasping ruler, blamed for every ill of a troubled realm. To later ages, he became something grander and more shadowy, time-honoured Lancaster, the venerable ancestor at the root of the royal tree, half buried in the dignity of his descendants. And to those who looked closer, there was always the other story, the human one, the long faithful love, and the grief for Blanche, and the loyalty that never broke, the man behind the monument. He was all of these, no doubt, at once, for powerful lives are rarely simple, and his was among the least simple of his age, crowded with power and ambition, and war and grief and love, lived out across nearly 60 years at the very heart of his country's story. And whatever the verdict, the plain facts of his legacy remain, written into the whole later history of England and beyond, the dynasty he founded, the wars his blood gave rise to, the kings and queens descended from him across half of Europe, the love that became, in the end, a line of monarchs. Few men who never wore a crown have left so deep a mark upon the world, and fewer still have left a mark so tangled, so much for good and for ill at once, as this proud, faithful, striving prince. The third son who was never a king, and who fathered, in the end, more kings than any king of his age. He chased crowns across the sea and never caught them, and made himself instead the ancestor of kings in England and Spain and Portugal, the grand old route from which half the royal blood of Europe would flow. And when at the end he laid his great life down, he asked only to be carried home to lie beside Blanche, the wife of his youth. In the tomb he had kept waiting for 30 years, and there he was buried. The proud, restless prince come home at last to his first love, while all unknowing he left behind him the seeds of a civil war and the seeds of a dynasty, the bitter harvest and the sweet, growing together out of the same royal blood. He has been gone now for more than 600 years, the old Duke of Lancaster, and the splendid Savoy is long vanished. And the splendid tomb at St. Paul's, where he lay beside his Blanche, was burned away in the fire that destroyed the old cathedral, so that not even his grave remains. The palace by the river is gone. The tomb is gone. The very dust of him is scattered. And of all the magnificence he gathered about himself in life, there is almost nothing left that a hand could touch. The castles have crumbled or been remade, the treasures are dispersed, the eminent household is 600 years in its own graves, and the proud overmighty duke, who once seemed so permanent a fixture of the world, the richest man in England, the ruler of the realm, has passed as utterly as the humblest of his servants into the long silence of the past. And yet he is not wholly gone, for the one thing that could not be burned or scattered was the blood, and the blood ran on. Down through all the kings and queens that came after, through the houses of Lancaster and York and Tudor and all that followed them, through the royal lines of Spain and Portugal and half the courts of Europe. The blood of John of Gaunt and the women he loved came down the centuries, mingling and spreading, until it runs, by now, in more veins than any herald could ever trace. The man is dust, and his palace is a name on a map, and his tomb is ash. But the line he founded outlasted every stone he ever raised, and in that sense the proud old duke, who reached so hungrily for permanence and grasped only the passing goods of the world, won in the end a kind of immortality after all. Not in marble or in gold, which burned, but in the living blood of the generations which did not. And somewhere in the long descent of it, through all the kings and queens that came after, the line still runs, even now. It is a strange thing to sit with, on a still night so many centuries on, the thought of how far the ripples of one life can spread. He lived and loved and reached and failed and died, this one man, 600 years ago, and thought, no doubt, mostly of the things near at hand, his wars and his lands and his children and the woman he loved, as we all think mostly of what is near at hand. He could not have known how long the consequences of his choices would run, that the love he kept faith with would become a dynasty, that the blood he passed on would sit on thrones he never dreamed of, that men and women centuries after him would still be tracing the slow descent of their fortunes back to him and the women he loved. We none of us know such things, of course. What will come of the small, faithful choices of our own lives? And there is a comfort in that, and a kind of grandeur, that the silent loyalties of the heart can outlast all the loud ambitions of the world, and run on, unseen, into a future we will never see. And on a quiet night 6 centuries on, we can still go back and sit a while beside his fire, and remember the third son who was never a king, and the woman he loved, and the long strange road they walked together. If these quiet evenings are something you would like to find your way back to, you are welcome to stay a while longer in this company, and to let this be a place you return to when the dark comes early and the house is still. There is no need to do anything at all. There is only sleep now, waiting for you, and the warm dark, and the fading memory of an old duke and his love growing soft and far away as you drift. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.